Are we live? We are live. Thank you, family, for watching. My name is Brother Greg, aka The Real Gilo. You are watching Glow Sessions, and today's episode is brought to you by One Shot Energy. For those of you that have issues with candy consumption, that's me. If you love Starburst, Skittles, all that good stuff, well, One Shot Energy, link is in the bio. They have what you call functional candy. So for those of you that are gamers, you're content creators, maybe you're a public speaker, maybe you just like to have focus and have your candy at the same time, they have what you call functional candy, everything from energy chews to focus chews. And I'll talk about the last one in just a second, but these functional candies have 75 milligrams of caffeine, 600 milligrams of nootropics. I know that's kind of a marketing term, but it kind of helps you become a little bit more sharper, more smarter. But they also have focus chews, which have the same benefits of the energy chews, but without the added caffeine, with immunity support, of course, the nootropic blend, and of course, vitamin support as well. Now, the last one that I'm excited about is actually the voice drops. So they got me on that Instagram ad. So for those of you that are on Instagram, they got me with this Instagram ad, and it hit me up with voice drops. So I'm excited to share these products with you guys. The voice drops are a low sugar yuzu honey lozenge, which soothes and protects your throat and voice, with slippery elm. I can't even pronounce the word, so we'll just use some fancy words later. Licorice root, and basically helps you for public speaking to be a little bit more relaxed and not so scratchy throat. You won't need as much hot tea and all the good stuff. Anyways, I'm spending a lot of time on this. OneShotEnergy.com, link is in the bio for those of you that are interested. They also have a voice bundle, which comes with energy and focus, and also a new flavor that's coming out. It's called Toxic Tanaveria. I don't even know what that is, so I want to check it out when I'm done today. Flavors like mandarin orange, blue raspberry, all your typical flavors. Promo code AMGLOW or AMBGLOW, and at checkout at OneShotEnergy.com, and we just partnered up with them, so we're excited to announce that partnership with you guys. Well, let's do this. Today we have a very special guest, and I met this person on social media, Twitter, or formerly known as Twitter. Now it's called X. Thanks, Elon. Dr. Christina Stai is a clinical psychologist. She's licensed in Iowa and California. She received her master's and doctorate degrees in clinical psychology from Azusa Pacific University in Southern California, and completed 2 bachelor's degrees in psychology and child development from California State University, Northridge. In 2019, they opened up their own small group practice called Holistic Resources Clinic, LLC, in Southeast Iowa. In this practice, they provide individual therapy and neuropsychological assessments for children, teens, and young adults. Now, Dr. Christina Stai is also an author of a book called Don't Pass It On, You Can Break the Cycle. And she also owns a publishing company along with her husband, Josh. I'm trying to speak proper English. I wanted to say brother Josh because I'm from Hawaii. So but I'm excited to have Dr. Christina with us today, and we're going to just hang out, talk story. We're going to talk about some issues, of course, in the area of psychology. Hopefully we'll cover some popular culture topics. We'll see. But ladies and gentlemen, in about 41 seconds, you're going to get a chance to meet Dr. Christina Stai. This is Glow Sessions episode number 51. We'll be back in 41 seconds.
This whole town could be red by the end of the day. If you feel alright, we can throw it and drive. With the radio so loud they can hear us from miles. Me and you, nothing to do.
Dr. Christina, thank you for joining us.
Hello, it's so to be here. Hi, everybody.
Man, I ran out of breath. Like I'm just trying to run through that whole spiel. I just picked that company up the other day, and I'm running out of breath and we, I was talking about being nervous. Oh my gosh, I don't want to mess this up, man.
No, you
But
did.
thank
You pronounced everything correctly. We have a very long name for our companies too, so it is a little bit of a. I get out
well,
of.
even the email. I was like, oh my gosh, I think I misspelled the email because it's holistic resources
Yeah,
clinic.
holistic resources clinic because just the holistic resources was taken. We tried for something shorter, but it did not work out.
Well, thank you for doing this today. I really appreciate your time. And of course, Josh, who's in the background, he's going to be our hype man in the background. So, Josh, I see you. Thank you. Um, I'm going to start with the question. Well, you know what? Let's do this. I just had some questions. Well, first of all, Azusa Pacific University. I'm
Yeah,
like, wow. Like, what the? I looked him up. Like, you did your master's and your doctorate there?
yeah. So it was the masters you kind of get just along the way. They give it to you basically, I think, just to kind of motivate you to keep going. But it's considered a non-terminal degree, so it was a doctoral program, and just after 2 years in the program, they awarded us a master's.
And so I got to ask this, like, bro, what the heck? Two bachelor's degree? How many years did it take you to do two bachelor's degrees?
I did it in 4 years. I did,
Wow.
yeah. Um, a lot of it was because so my majors were I went in with a major in psychology, and then my very first job I actually worked at a daycare center on campus. So they had a daycare basically for students who had children so that they could have their children be in daycare and they could still attend school. So it was really cool, and they were really trying to cater, I think, for like younger parents and things, just to try to make education more attainable for them. Um, and so I worked in this daycare, and all of my coworkers there, they were all child development majors. And so they started talking to me about their classes and their program, and they essentially convinced me I didn't want to just drop my psychology major. So I just added the child development major after my first semester. But there's a lot of overlap between psychology and child development. So I was still able to, there were some classes I could double count for each major. And I went into college with some credits already just from high school. So I was still able to knock it out in 4 years.
My wife did bachelor's for business administration in 3 years. And that was hard for us because we're, got a family and she's working on her master's degree. So she just finished, literally just finished last week. So
Wow,
I,
congratulations. That's awesome.
it's hard, bro, when you got kids and we're in ministry and we have business projects that we do. We have, one, two, three, we have three LLCs that we operate. So many different moving parts. And for her to get her degree at this chapter of life, I'm super proud of her. And the fact that you got two, bro, that's legit. I will say this. And then the book, we'll talk about that in a second, but so the book is something you authored.
Mhm.
Don't pass it on. I read a little bit of it, and you can break the cycle. One thing that got my attention was the postpartum, because my wife went through that, the postpartum. What inspired you to write the book? Just out of curiosity, what inspired you to write it?
Yeah, so the book is actually based off of my doctoral dissertation. So when you go through a doctoral program, you have to do a dissertation, and I opted to do what was called it was like a clinical application because I wanted like a final product at the end. So essentially what I did for my dissertation is I did a bunch of research around eating disorders. I was really interested, particularly in the mother-child relationship. So I did a lot of research around it, and then I created a sort of workbook to kind of navigate the role that mothers play in the development of eating disorders in their own children, and kind of because it is a very it's cyclical, and it does tend to go from generation to generation. So that was my dissertation, and then it took me a while because after my dissertation I was just really burnt out on the topic because I had spent essentially like the last 5 years researching and working on it. And so I needed a little space from it. But then I did eventually go back and cleaned it up and added more to it. And then that was the book that I published.
Okay, we'll talk about that and the publishing company maybe a little bit later on. But I gotta ask, because I looked it up. First of all, you guys have a beautiful office, by the way, and a beautiful YouTube channel. I love the quality of it. So, but Kelowna, what the heck is Kelowna, Iowa?
Kelowna is a very small rural town. There's a pretty big Amish and Mennonite community here. It is the closest city to where I live is Iowa City. So some people know about Iowa City. The University of Iowa is there. The Hawkeyes got some credibility recently because Caitlin Clark from their
yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so we're just south of Iowa City. So
funny you say that, because I've been watching a lot of videos on Caitlin Clark, and bruh, she is legit. I think they played. Is it Iowa State? Is that the name of the college? Or Iowa? What's the name of the college she graduated?
She is from the University of Iowa.
University.
Mm-hmm.
They played in front of like 70,000 people. This one game, it was unbelievable, and it was outdoors somewhere. I can't remember where it was, but yeah, Caitlin Clark is legit, bro. I will say. So you're in Amish. Is that considered like Amish country or in that region?
Yeah, it's pretty rural, pretty agricultural. Yeah.
Well, I got Amish make the best butter. I'm just saying. I got Amish butter in my refrigerator. It's this big butter roll. I'm not sure if you ever seen it. I think they sell it at Safe. Yeah,
they're awesome.
Yeah. You ever thought of ditching the technology and just like, hey, I'm gonna get a horse and buggy? You guys ever thought of
it? I've been tempted many times. Yes. It would probably not be too difficult to do here.
How do you change from where you are now to horse and buggy and making your own food and butter? That's pretty intense.
Yeah. Well, honestly, the change from Southern California just to Iowa in general, that was a pretty big shift, just like culturally and geographically.
Now, you're from Iowa originally?
I'm from Southern California originally.
Oh, okay. Wow. That's a culture shock.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I'm from Hawaii, so like, and as a kid, I used to live in the South, but born and raised Hawaiian. My mom's Hawaiian Chinese, dad's Filipino. To move to a town that's we live in a rancher's town right now, so we have a home here and a property in Hawaii. But here it's a culture shock. It's a farm town, It's like there's no diversity at all. So, but they're very gracious here. They're super. I feel the farm towns are so hardworking that they don't have time for nonsense or drama. That's how I feel. Mm-hmm. That's how I feel anyway.
Yeah.
So I'm going to get right into some of my notes. I share a little bit with you, but here's my question is, of all of your education and expertise, why children and teenagers? Why did you choose that approach in your area of psychology?
Yeah. I think the simple answer for that is I love kids, and I ever since like when I was old enough to start babysitting, I started babysitting. I always felt like I could connect really well with kids. I felt like they gravitated towards me. And then as I got older, I felt like kids were a little bit easier to relate to even than adults. So yeah, that it kind of started from there. So I knew pretty early on that I, wanted to work with kids and teens. And so that's even, in my studies and with the jobs that I had, and then in the classes that I took, I geared most everything to children and adolescents. And then with my graduate program, I obviously had kind of more of like a generalized education. So I learned how to do therapy with adults as well, and how to do assessment with both children and adults. And so in therapy right now, I do work just with kids and teens and some young adults. I've had some that I started out as teens and that I, then they became young adults, and I still work with them. And I do testing with all ages. But yeah, my heart really just has always been with kids. I've always just felt like I could connect really well to them.
So you're that auntie, you're that auntie that plays with the kids at the family dinners.
Yeah, I'd rather hang out with the kids than with the
Yeah.
most of the time.
You know, life is easier when you're a kid. Except for King Kong. I'm gonna get some free therapy from you, but I was so scared of King Kong as a kid. Like, he used to live in my hallway, up in the top corner. So every time I went into the hallway, I would always have to run out of the hallway because I knew he was waiting for me, you know. But other than that, yeah, life is easier as a kid. Yeah, it really is. Now, play therapy. Do you do play therapy with kids? Like, I'm not sure if that's the right term.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I definitely do some. We transitioned to being fully virtual about 4.5 years ago when the pandemic first hit. So it looks a little bit different now. But I would say, yeah, I definitely do that. I love sand tray. I learned how to do sand tray therapy. But really, you know, play therapy can be, I mean, with anyone that has an imagination, you can do any sort of play therapy. I do love that, especially when working with kids that maybe have a little bit of a harder time opening up or talking directly about things, because there's a way that you can kind of just indirectly address topics and issues without having to be directly talking about the thing and directly processing it. And my experience is that most kids just tend to process things a little bit better that way anyway. Most of my kids are not just like, I'm going to sit on this couch and like stare at you for the next 60 minutes and just talk to you, right? It's very interactive. So when I was doing in-person work, especially, like most of my work I'd be on the ground with them. We'd be, you know, playing with different things or doing a game together or doing an activity together. And there would be discussion and dialogue along the way. But when there's like another activity to be doing alongside it, I feel like that really helps with the processing piece of it.
I think we all, when it comes to conversation, I try to convince my wife that in the area of play therapy, I'm trying to connect this dot. But I used to try to convince her that, you know, honey, video games are a great way for me to communicate, you know. So I used to have a PlayStation 4. I had the whole Xbox, and it's funny because I literally bought and sold 3 of them just because I couldn't manage my time well. But that's not really play therapy. But my oldest daughter, a lot of people may not know this story, but I think most people do. But we adopted her. She was a foster child, still family, you know, it was from my wife's family. But she was traumatized in a very, very heavy way. And so one of the things we had to do was play therapy. And I didn't know what that was at the time. And it's amazing what they uncover with just a child sitting there with a table full of toys and them communicating while they're playing with toys. And the one that really broke my heart was when they had the dolls. That one really shook a little bit when they brought out the toys and the dolls, and they kind of explained, hey, this is proper, improper. But the play therapy is I think is very effective. But that's a long time ago. That daughter, I think I shared with you, she just graduated college in Boston, and she got married. So through all of that trauma and things she's been through as a baby, yeah, she's full-on graduate, and she's doing well. So play therapy is legit. That
is awesome. Yeah, I worked in the foster care system for 3 years. That's where I did my internship, and my postdoc fellowship was in in Southern California, I don't know if you're familiar with the Camarillo area, but there's it's an emergency shelter. So it's a shelter for foster care youth. So I worked there for 3 years. So yeah, that's probably the hardest job that I've ever had, but I met like the strongest, bravest kids out of that.
Did you ever, especially in a foster program, did you ever feel like or fantasize about, you know what, I'm going to change my clothes at nighttime. I'm going to become a vigilante superhero and protect these kids, you know? It's a joke, but I asked Dr. John the same. I don't know if you know who Dr. John is. He's a clinical psychologist. And we talked about that as well, where all the things we see, even as parents, or even what you do. But how do you navigate through so you did 3 years of working in a foster program?
Yeah, I did.
That's a long time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
A lot of kids too. Wow.
Yeah, it was a lot. I mean, yeah, it was a lot emotionally and mentally. It was definitely my biggest learning experience. I think it made me really prepared for the work that I do, because I had some of the hardest cases there. But like I said, I mean, I think I learned more from the clients that I worked with, the kids that I worked with, and I think they learned from me sometimes. So yeah.
Well, we learn from our kids for sure, especially in the traumas that they go through. We fostered 3 kids before my daughter. Actually, around the same time. Actually, they were kind of, in Hawaii we say hanai, which is basically like family.
Mm-hmm.
So culturally, if my sister has an issue, and I'll be transparent, I've shared this before, but my sister-in-law used to have a drug problem, and so we took the kids in. No question, there was no debate. There was no. This, they're going to come stay with us, and you figure out what you got to figure out. And there was some drama, of course, with that. But to see kids go through that, and now that they're all graduated and older now, I'm glad we took them in. I'm glad that we disciplined them as they were our own children. Mm-hmm. And we learned a lot. Like, these kids are tough, man. They different breed, different fabric, So with what you're doing now, you're not hybrid at the time. You're mostly remote right now. Is that the type of practice you are now?
Yeah, fully virtual.
And so most of your cases, are they in Iowa, or do you have some in California too?
No, they're all in Iowa. So I did originally get licensed in California. My license is in inactive status, so I'm still licensed because I worked really hard for that licensure. It's really hard to get licensed in California, so I'm really proud of it. I don't want to let it go, even though I don't know if I ever will practice again in California, but I want to hold on to the license. But all my active license is in Iowa, so all of my clients are Iowa residents. But having it be over a telehealth format means, I can see people from all over the state. So I have people from literally all over the state, which is really cool. It's provided a level of just like accessibility that a lot of, especially in more of the rural locations, because there's a lot of rural areas in Iowa. And, to have to drive, hours to like some of the big cities, whether that be, Iowa City or Des Moines, that's just not feasible for a lot of people. So with telehealth as an option now, I would say that there's just so many more people within the state that have access to mental health services that didn't before.
Well, we can thank COVID for speeding that process up.
That would be say one of the silver linings for COVID was that it really kind of propelled this telehealth format, because it was like kind of available before, but not very many people used it, and you had to use a very specific platform, and it was really cumbersome. So yeah, and now there's state laws in place now too. So it just, as far as like insurance coverage and compensation for services and things like that, it's treated equally whether you're telehealth or in person.
That was a question I was going to ask, because I know physicians don't do things for money, but you've got to pay bills too, right? So I guess that process should be streamlined by now, right? With the whole not having to worry about the financials, right? I'll share this side story. My uncle is a dentist. He's been a dentist for 40 years. And the last time I saw him, I said, "Uncle, why don't you just retire?" And he says, "I cannot, because I just bought a new machine." So the thing with doctors and people that have their own practices, I don't think he had to buy the new machine, but he just wanted to buy this new, and the new machine was like $3 million or some crazy dollar amount. Mm-hmm. So of course he's going to keep working to pay it off, and but he does it because he loves it, Is this something you think you're going to do for the next 30 years, or is there other interesting things that you might shift into and migrate to?
Yeah, I love what I do, and I think I would say like I have kind of a good diversity with what I do now, because I do some individual therapy, but I also do testing. I do psych and neuropsych testing, so I can do testing for ADHD, autism, learning disabilities, things like that. And so that gives me like a pretty good variety. I would say I have probably about a 50-50 split right now between therapy and testing clients. But yeah, there are other things that I love doing. I mean, I am a writer. I do enjoy writing. My book was definitely a labor of love. And so I do, and that was, one of my biggest dreams was to be a published author. So I'd love to be able to continue writing. I also love speaking, so I could envision me doing more of this. I have been on a couple of podcasts before. I do enjoy public speaking, so I could see that doing some teaching for like continuing education units, or maybe teaching some classes, being like a guest professor or something like that. So I think, that's the thing that's to me really cool about the field of psychology, and why I was so drawn to it is there's so much diversity in what you can do with the degree. So I love what I'm doing now. I don't feel like I'm not tired of it. I don't feel like a strong urge to do something totally different. But I would say, ideally, I'd like to bring on a couple of other clinicians into our practice and have them, because there's a huge influx. There's a big need for therapists where I am. And so I'd love to be able to bring on a couple of other clinicians, fill them up, and then I might have a little bit more time to do some of the extras, like the writing and the public speaking and things like that.
I did see the sign-on bonus on your website. So yeah.
We are actively searching. Yeah.
That's cool, because that town is not that big, right? But yeah, you guys have a lot of clients or overflow. Are you having to turn people away? Is that one of the reasons?
Yeah. I mean, I would say so in the town that I'm located in, I don't necessarily get a ton of referrals specifically from that town, but from the cities surrounding it, there's definitely a big influx. I have just started turning therapy clients away, mainly because testing is such a big need here as well. And there's most of the other, well, first of all, there's not a lot of people who do testing in the state. Testing can really only be done by psychologists. And I didn't know this before I moved here, but there aren't that many psychologists in Iowa. So, and then even with all of the psychologists, not all of them do testing. So there are places right now that have a wait list out, a year and a half, 2 years. And I am really kind of trying to help that need and help so that people aren't having to wait as long for the assessment. So I started turning therapy clients away so I can accommodate more of the testing. But I would say that most of my colleagues that I know in the area, they're booked up as well, and there's still a need. So yes, we need more therapists just in general in the state.
You were talking about, we were talking about COVID, and I get these ads that are telling me to go get therapy because I can get off my phone, or you can pick or select your therapist. I feel like there is an influx of more people, and I know I'm jumping the gun on one of my subjects, but I feel like I'm getting hit with these apps where, hey, get paired up with a therapist today, and it's easier today than, let's say, 3 years ago to get services. And I think, I don't know if I'm hitting the right point here, but I feel like there was more accessibility. Maybe people aren't working as much; they're working from home, so they have more time to be consumed or absorbed by these things. And when they get hit up with an ad, yeah, maybe I do need therapy. Maybe I should go get some counseling of some sorts. I wanted to cover this part, is the neurodivergent. topic.
Mhm.
I don't think I was, but my dad said that I didn't talk until I was 5. That's what my dad said. I didn't say my first. So they thought maybe something was wrong with me. Maybe I was autistic, but I've never been tested or anything to that effect. And people always say, this is a really bad joke, but people always tell my dad, wow, that's a miracle that your son started talking. And so my dad always says, well, I'm still waiting for the miracle. And they always say, well, what miracle is that? And my dad is like, I'm waiting for the miracle for him to just shut up because he won't stop talking. So can we talk about the neurodivergent topic? Because I've never heard of that term until maybe the past 5-6 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I did look it up, but like in the term in itself, what does it actually mean to be neurodivergent?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I will say, I mean, I think you're not alone in just having like only kind of come across this topic maybe in the last 5 or 6 years. I mean, I personally felt like there was a really big influx also kind of, around the COVID period. I was all of a sudden getting a huge influx of testing referrals, particularly from the adult population who were interested in being tested for autism or ADHD. But, I would say there's in the simplest terms that I can think of, neurodivergence essentially just means diverging from what the norm or the kind of average is. So I like to think of it as, neurodivergent folks have brains that tend to be wired a little bit differently and to think differently than those with, neurotypical brains.
Well, I will say I agree with the recent, especially in social media. There's been a lot of people saying that they have this and they have this diagnoses, and I shared this with Dr. Heath and even Dr. John.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like there's been a lot of people that use certain terminologies, and I don't mean to offend anybody in any way, but I feel like there are people that say, "Oh, I have this or that," and I don't know if they've ever tested themselves or if they're self-diagnosing. And I feel like it's for some, it's like it's a way to get attention. And I mean, is that unfair for me to say something like that? Because I don't want to be offensive, obviously. But have you found that people sometimes maybe label themselves because it gets them a certain type of attention?
I don't know that I would necessarily say that I feel like people do it for attention, but I have definitely noticed there's been a trend, especially on social media, because again, around the same time, I think there's been around the same time of when COVID hit, there's been, I would just say, like a growing movement, for advocacy around neurodivergent rights and education and proper training. And awareness around, what it even means to be neurodivergent, because I would say, historically, our view on what it means to be a certain thing has been so boxed in. We see everything through a box, where the reality, from my perspective and my experience, is that, everything really exists on a spectrum. So there's been a neurodiversity movement, which I think overall has been really positive, but it has definitely led to, I think, there are a lot of folks that then are going towards, self-diagnosing, which I do see self-diagnosis for the most part as valid. And I think that, accessibility is one thing. Not everybody has the resources or the finances to be able to go and get like a formal assessment. If you don't get, I mean, I can just speak transparently, I take insurance, and the vast majority of the folks that I do testing with, their insurance covers, a good portion of it. But if I were to do like a purely out of pocket assessment, no insurance, nothing, I mean, a full comprehensive evaluation is like thousands of dollars. And that's just not accessible to most people. Some people it is. And I have had people who even intentionally will go private pay because they just don't want insurance involved. And that's, I guess, another story. But But I think like accessibility is one thing. So for those who don't necessarily have the resources or the ability to be able to go get a formal assessment, I don't think it's inappropriate to do research and to, kind of be doing some of that self-exploration. But I do have a concern, because what I do tend to see a lot on social media is, people making, reels or a TikTok video about, well, if you have, XYZ, then you are this.
Mm-hmm.
The vast majority of the videos that I've seen, I'm looking at these and I'm like, yeah, actually, that's not diagnostic criteria for autism, or that's not diagnostic criteria for ADHD, or it might be diagnostic criteria for something else, but they're describing it as another thing. So I think that, we need to tread really carefully around that, because I think there's potential for there's just to be like a lot of misinformation perpetuated, and then people are, labeling themselves or diagnosing themselves, and, it might not be accurate, at the end of the day. So, yeah,
it is a double-edged sword. And growing up, we didn't have a lot of these terminologies. Like, I joke about it, but I think I had ADHD as a kid, and my dad would just spank it out of me, so I'm okay now. But I know I didn't have it. But we joke about, now that I'm older, I'm a parent now. So, but there were times when we would just flash this term like, "Oh, I'm OCD," and I'm like, "No, you're not." You just, it's just kind of loosely throw it out there. But I do agree that giving people accessibility and giving them access. Now, there are some concerns that I made some notes of in the area of people that are neurodivergent, and that's eating disorders, maybe traumas that maybe, and anxiety and depression that tags along to these. Mm-hmm. Can you share some stories, or maybe some things that you can share in regards to connect the dots from anxiety and depression in regards to someone that may be neurodivergent?
Yeah. I guess I don't know if you want anything specific, but I would say that, my experience has been that a lot of times, especially when there is undiagnosed neurodivergence, so if somebody has ADHD or is autistic, or has a learning disability, or things along those lines, but it hasn't been diagnosed, that can be a lot of times there is, kind of residual like anxiety and depression that develops as a result of not being diagnosed, not having the proper accommodations in place or the proper resources. Because a lot of times, people in those situations where if they aren't diagnosed, and I would say this happens a lot with kids especially, is they just end up feeling like there's something wrong with them. Mm-hmm. And that, if you feel like there's something wrong with you, or you don't fit in, or you're not like the other kids, that is going to, it's not, it doesn't take a rocket science, a scientist to figure out that, well, yeah, that can lead to depression and anxiety and low self-esteem. If you just don't think like other kids, or if you're having a hard time getting along with others, or making friends, or keeping friends, or, following along in a conversation, or things like that. So I definitely would say that, I think that the anxiety and depression often gets identified first, right? And that is maybe just, oh yeah, like, this kid's depressed, or this kid has anxiety. And that may be true, but I would say particularly for those that have not been diagnosed with a neurodivergent condition yet, it is very common to see, anxiety and depression kind of manifest as a result of that. So I would say not necessarily like a true depressive disorder or true anxiety disorder, because once they're appropriately diagnosed and they get the right accommodations and the right resources, then a lot of times I see that anxiety and depression, if not disappear completely, at least be really significantly minimized, because they're getting what they need at that point.
I used to work for a company called Nurse Finders when I was in college. And basically what I did was I offered respite care to parents. Mm-hmm. So a lot of my clients were diagnosed with either ADHD, and I love working with those kids. I would basically shadow them at school and basically help kind of guide their behavior so they don't get kicked out of the class, basically, and there are these directives. And One kid, he was so embarrassed because he was in a general classes, but everybody knew that he was special education, right? Because of me. But whenever he started to get triggered by something, you could not force him into any corner or any box. You just had to let him vent and let him say what he needed to say, and genuinely actually be there with him, so he knows that you're listening, that you care. And once he was okay with that, then he would focus. Extremely intelligent, right? It's just there's certain things, and of course it stemmed from trauma from home. Mom was in and out of institutions and drugs and all that stuff, so that didn't help as well. But another one that I worked with had he was, how tall was he? I think he was like 5'10", 250 pounds, autistic, very physical. And I learned a lot from that one client. But we were driving one day and he kept laughing. So I'm driving, he's in the passenger seat. I took him to the mall, we went shopping and gave the parents a break. And he kept laughing. I said, Chris, I'll use a fake name. I said, Chris, why are you laughing? He didn't tell me. And there was this car next to me. They looked at me and they told me, pull over. They wanted to fight me. And I'm like, oh no, what did you do, Chris? And he had his middle finger hit. He kept sticking middle finger to the guys on the road. I was like, oh no, Chris. I had to explain to the guys, no, that, hey, this is. And to this day, I don't know. I don't know what that was. I really don't know. It's a funny story. But I'm saying all that, Dr. Christina, that I do believe it's important to get these diagnosed, to know what's going on, because sometimes you don't know, right? Like my son has sensory processing disorder. And I didn't know what that was until my wife kind of walked me through that. And I learned a lot through that, and learning how to love my kid and giving him space. And he's that kid that has to touch the spaghetti, right? He has to squish it in his hands. Maybe you can help me with this, Dr. Christina, but we keep running out of shampoo and conditioner. Like, I'm not even kidding. Like, if we buy a bottle of shampoo, it's going to be gone by tomorrow because he likes to squeeze it and play with it.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Do you have any any tips or tricks on how to get our son to stop using all the shampoo or conditioner?
I mean, well, find maybe something cheaper that he can use. But it seems like it's a sensory thing, right? Like, so
Yeah.
when it comes to sensory needs, I think that there tend to be we tend to be either sensory seekers, like we're very seeking of like sensory input, or we're avoidant. And we could be seeking and avoidant at the same time for different stimuli, right? So it sounds like he's a high sensory needs kid. Like, so he needs a lot of input. So I would say either find something with the same consistency that is cheaper, but it seems like that's what it is. And maybe the consistency, but I would wonder if part of it is the smell. Like, is there like a sense to it that he likes? Does he like what is it about it that, that he's drawn to with it? So that would be kind of a fun thing to explore. But yeah, it seems like that's it. And what I would say is that for those that are sensory seeking, it's fulfilling a need, right? There's something about like that input that is regulating, for those folks.
Do you think that's something he's going to have throughout life? Like, as an adult?
So I would say any type of neurodivergence, I mean, we're really talking about, it's the way that your brain is wired, right? So it's not something that like gets cured or that goes away. I would say that it can manifest in varying degrees, right? We don't necessarily manifest with like the same like level of presentation from childhood into adulthood. And a lot of that, I think, just, as we grow up and get older, we learn more regulation skills, right? So and then like our executive functioning kind of comes online as we get a little bit older too, and especially like I'm going to get a little nerdy and scientific with the brain, but our prefrontal cortex is the very last part of your brain to develop, and that is the part of your brain that is in charge of like problem solving and strategizing, and really working through some of the regulations. So that part of your brain isn't fully developed until you're around 25. I've seen some studies now showing that it's even maybe upwards around 27 by the time that part of your brain is fully developed. So like the problem solving, like common sense, judgment, all of that is tied up in the prefrontal cortex. So that part of your brain, when that comes more online, then the regulation tends to get a little bit better. But if we're talking about the way that the kind of root of how your brain is wired doesn't really ever change.
I'll make the argument that there are some guys in their late 40s that still haven't fully matured. So
of their prefrontal cortex fully.
Yeah, I think they put it on pause. But, since you're getting all geeky and nerdy, I'm a huge fan of Dr. Carolyn Leaf. I really enjoy her discussions, and I know she's a little bit different field, but the whole science of the brain.
Mm-hmm.
So people that, if their brain is wired a certain way, like how we're talking about, what type of, I'm trying to find the right words, but in terms of growth, let's say I'm 55 years old and let's say I have autism. Is there something in the brain, like when they mature, like for example, I guess what I'm getting at is my son going to be wasting shampoo bottles when he's 47 years old? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Well, probably not. But I would say what the reason why he wouldn't be isn't because that sensory need necessarily goes away, but because he finds something else that can fulfill that need, right? Mm-hmm. So when it becomes his finances, if he's like, man, like I don't want to spend all of this money on shampoo, he might find something else, right? But I would say typically like the sensory, and that being said, I mean, I will say sensory needs do change, so that's not to say that he's always going to have that like same level of sensory needs. But I mean, I would say that as we get older, we tend to find ways of maybe different ways of doing things. If it's something that, that we need to make some sort of adjustment to for any reason. But I think like our basic sensory needs, while they can shift, I would say for the most part tend to stay relatively stable over time, barring like, I would say when we're under states of like stress, then like our sensory profile can change. It tends to become more heightened when, there's like a trauma or a stressor or things like that. So that's where I think you can see some regulations, not regulations, but there can be some ebbs and flows in like how how we even like perceive things and in our sensory environment.
So, as a kid, I'm a product of the 80s or 70s, whatever. I was born in the 70s, but product of the 80s, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. But our thinking back then was, and I'm going to use this not as me, that's not my level of thinking, but these are the terminologies that I used to use as a kid, that people that were neurodivergent, we would consider them mentally, we would use the word mentally retarded, or we would use that term. And it was obviously very mean and unfair, but that was the terminology back then. That's all we knew. And we were taught that, mm-hmm. that they were not able to function, or once they're out of school, like they're not beneficial to society. But I shared this with my last podcast with Dr. John about Daryl Hannah. Mm-hmm. Do you know who Daryl Hannah is, the actress?
I looked her up after I watched.
Yeah.
After I watched that podcast episode. Yeah. I
didn't know, and interesting how she came out years later, right? And she said, "I'm actually autistic," and it's just powerful. I mean, that all the things that she's done, and it definitely debunked things, our level of thinking. In the area of that, for kids that are in school today, that let's say they have autism, what are their what's available to them? I'll just leave it at that. Like when they graduate high school, what have you seen of like public figures or maybe business leaders? I know there's one growing up who was a famous actor. There's a famous song, "Oh Bloody, oh Bloody, life goes on." I forget the name of the actor, but very famous actor, and he was I think he had Down syndrome, I believe. Can't remember. The functionality of people that have certain types of disorders. What do you see them becoming, or jobs or things that they have available to them? I know that's a very broad question, but
well, I mean, I think the first thing is that we kind of need to qualify what level of like support needs are we talking about, right? Because
mm-hmm.
for autism, for example, autism exists on a spectrum. So you know, what you grew up with, which you know, is not, I mean, that's kind of what I was born in the 80s, raised in the 90s. But I mean, that was like my level of awareness around it too, right? That there were these kids with special needs, and that they had, you know, an intellectual disability, the vast majority of them. And I would say like there definitely are autistic individuals that also have a co-occurring intellectual disability. But that's one of the things that I think has been really misunderstood and stereotyped within the, you know, autistic diagnosis, is that all autistic individuals have an intellectual disability, and that's not true. Or all autistic individuals have a really high level of support needs, and that's not true. So, and that's been, I would say, you know, even over the last handful of years, that there's been this big like expanding and widening around like the diagnostic, not really the diagnostic criteria, but our understanding and interpretation of the diagnostic criteria. Because there are a large subset of, just to take autism, for example, there's a large subset of autistic individuals that are very highly intelligent, that have very low support needs. So in terms of, you know, needing additional kind of support or resources or accommodations, not everybody needs accommodations. There is, you know, is a large number of individuals that live independently, work independently, have their own families, have their own house, have, you know, so I think we really need to kind of qualify, you know, and distinguish between like what level of support needs are we talking about. But I would say, you know, for those that have a higher level of support needs, so whether that be, you know, an intellectual disability, or that, you know, just because of certain aspects. So somebody who has really significant sensory sensitivities, for example, so cannot, you know, tolerate certain noises, or certain textures, or bright lights, or things like that. I would say, you know, accommodations should really be very individualized in terms of what, you know, what that person specifically needs. But I would say that there's, you know, a variety of supports, whether that be like vocational rehab supports, or whether that be, you know, but I think honestly, like a lot of it really comes with diagnosis too, and awareness around like being able to kind of connect in with yourself and realizing, you know, what is it that I need? Because I think that I would say that that's just the greatest level of empowerment that we can give somebody, right? Is to learn how to connect in with themselves, with their body, with their brain, and to understand and be able to communicate in one way or another, right? Whether that be verbally, whether that be through like an alternative communication device, whether that be through sign language, whether that be through gesturing, you know, being able to advocate for and communicate what their needs are in that moment.
So when you say spectrum, because I didn't have that growing up, we didn't have that language of, you know, the spectrum. Like how diverse is this spectrum? Like what can, I don't even, that's the right question, but when you say someone is on a spectrum, so for someone like me, how do you explain to someone like me, like I'm on the spectrum, or this person, like how do you explain that, the spectrum?
Well, I would say the spectrum is very diverse and wide ranging. And I would say that, I mean, that's one of the things that I've seen over the last handful of years, is that our understanding of the autism spectrum in particular, because I would make an argument that pretty much everything exists on a spectrum, right? Like anxiety exists on a spectrum, ADHD exists on a spectrum, depression exists on a spectrum, OCD exists on a spectrum. But I think that particularly within, I would say like within like the ADHD and autistic communities, there's been just a growing, I would say just a higher level of education and awareness around like what that actually means, and that it is a very broad ranging spectrum. It's not as narrow as we were, I was going to say, as I was led to believe, because, you know, even when I was in school and going through my, you know, my doctoral training, I've worked with the neurodivergent population for decades at this point. But I'm neurodivergent, and I didn't know that I was neurodivergent until like decades later. So I think, you know, I had such a narrow view of what that was and what I was taught that was. So I think it's hard, I think, to describe to people when somebody asks like, well, what does it mean to be on the spectrum? Mm-hmm. But I think, you know, that's why it's important to have discussion about it and what it can look like to be on the spectrum, because I would say that, you know, the vast majority of people that I encounter are not going to necessarily tag me as an autistic individual, but I am. But I don't necessarily like look that way or present that way. So I think that, you know, our concept of what autism looks like, what ADHD looks like, what, you know, anything looks like.
So how did you find out that? Did you do your own assessment? Did you see someone? How did you figure that out?
Well, I essentially self-diagnosed, which I felt that's what I do for a living, is I test people for ADHD and autism. So first of all, I mean, I have resources available to me that not everybody else has. And I think, you know, and I have known other psychologists and other mental health professionals that have gone out and gotten their own, like have gotten a professional diagnosis, a formal diagnosis. And some people, you know, feel like they need that or they want that, you know, for a number of reasons. I don't particularly at this point in my life feel like I don't feel like I need to kind of prove myself to anything. I mean, I feel very confident in that now. But I will say, like, it was something, like, I did not see this in myself when this had been, like, a population that I'd been working with for, at that point, I mean, like, 15 years. So I think that, I think that what it really is going to take is, you know, kind of ongoing conversations like this, and having people be vocal about what it looks like, you know, to be a neurodivergent individual and to have a neurodivergent brain, because it starts pulling us out of like those stereotypes then, because I think, you know, we tend to go off of what we see in movies or what we see in TV shows or what we've been taught or what we've seen in schools or what our teachers have told us. And so, I think that, you know, that kind of ongoing conversation is what, you know, helps raise that awareness and help kind of broaden, like, you know, that outside of the box kind of thinking.
Well, you know, like, I'll be transparent. Like, I'm sure there's some things that if I had the opportunity to self-diagnose, I would probably feel like maybe I'm not good enough, or maybe I don't meet a standard of what my peers like. Did you have, when you self-diagnose, were there any feeling how did you feel like after you figured out certain things that, wow, okay, like, was there any change in your demeanor or the way you thought on life? Or
I mean, I think that it's I would say, like, there's a lot of complexity to it, because I think that there's like an element of kind of like connecting the dots and being like, oh, okay, like this kind
that's
of
why.
well, okay, yeah, this is why. Or even, I mean, the first thing, honestly, like there were things that I wasn't even aware that I was doing. Like, I mean, some of the first things, like my husband was actually the one that, I was talking about an autistic client one day, anonymously, of course, but like just kind of about various aspects. And he was like kind of looking at me funny, and he's like, well, he's like, Christina, he's like, well, you do all of those things too. And I was like, what? He's like, yeah, like you do all of those things too. And I'm like, no, I don't. He's like, well, yeah, you do. Like, I live with you. Like, you do these things. And so I think that like there's so much that like I just wasn't even necessarily aware of that I was doing what he was referring to stimming. Like there were certain stims that I was doing that like I just like had I had no clue. Like I just was kind of doing them subconsciously, and he would like just kind of see me doing these like weird movements and things like that, and I didn't even really know I was doing them. So like that was just an aspect of it, but there were, I think, some places where I started then connecting the dots or kind of just becoming a little bit more aware about like myself and who I was as a person. But there definitely was, I would say, like a grieving process that came with it, because I think that, so just as a whole, I mean, there still is such like a huge stigma against anything that isn't like quote unquote normal or typical. Also, I mean, just the world that we live in, the society that we live in was designed for the neurotypical individual. So, living in a world that wasn't necessarily built for me. I mean, that is where, many would argue that, if we consider these conditions to be a disability, that most of the reason why they're a disability is because we are trying to function in a world that just wasn't really designed for us. But I think that, there has, and I'm still in this process, I would say, of coming to terms with certain things where I do have limitations in some areas, and I do have sensitivities in some areas. I have weaknesses in some areas. I have, things that I need to work on in some areas where I would say that like things that, if I really focus on them, that I can work on them and get, better or improve on those things. But there are certain aspects of my brain that are just like, this just is how my brain is, and this is never going to be something that comes easily to me. Doesn't necessarily mean that I can't do it, but this is never going to be something that is just like easy for me. And I think, as a person that is I'm very perfectionistic in my thinking. I'm very rigid in my thinking, which is classic autistic. But that's been really hard for me because I'm an overachiever. I'm a perfectionist, and so coming to terms with the fact that like I'm never going to like attain this level of perfection, even though I know just like as a human, I know that that's not possible, right? But that's probably been like the hardest thing for me, is actually accepting the parts of myself that and really seeing it like, for me in some of these areas, like this is a disability. This is something that is hard for me. This is never going to be something that comes easily for me. I can work on things, I can improve things, but but that's the thing, is I'm going to have to work really hard to do some of these things. And so I think that's something that still to this day, I am working on coming to terms with, because things will pop up at various times in my life, right? Because there's some things I'm great at. And then, when I'm confronted with something that is a struggle or a challenge, that's where it gets to be really hard for me sometimes.
So is that kind of like what you were saying earlier? That's part of the grieving process, is walking through those seasons or chapters as they come.
Yeah, that has been for me. I mean, I can't speak for everybody, but I would say that, the vast majority of adults that I know that have been diagnosed in adulthood do go through a grieving process of like kind of just coming to terms with like the limitations of your own brain, of your own body. And that, and again, everyone has a very individualized experience. So that's not necessarily something that everybody goes through, but it is a common thread that I see.
Have you ever do you use the term neuroplasticity a lot? Is that something you're familiar with in terms of? I think the word is growth. I think that's Dr. Carolyn Leaf talks about neuroplasticity a lot. Have you listened to any of her public speaking events or any of her speeches? I guess if you.
I think I'm familiar with her. I am familiar with the term of neuroplasticity. Like
Yeah.
our brain is neuroplastic. We are like constantly growing and developing new neural pathways. And so, yeah, like that part I think is like really cool. That part is really cool to me. So I would say like, yeah, in terms of like thinking in terms of neuroplasticity, that is where like I would say I don't ever want people to get to a place of just like necessarily, if there's something that you are really wanting to shift or change, and it's very important to you, you know, that I would say like the brain is an amazing thing. And I think the brain is capable of a lot of things. But what I would say is that there's no amount of neuroplasticity that is going to turn my brain into a non-autistic brain.
Right.
End of the day, right?
I guess some of the questions I had when I was kind of looking over what we're going to talk about today was if we believe in what she teaches. One of the things she teaches is that, you know, the brain was designed to change. Is there any part of the brain that, I think one of the words I'm going to try to read it, but she said, can the mind change the brain? I'm sure that's a catchphrase, but can the mind can the mind change the brain? And can the mind influence the brain? And it's something that she's been doing 30 years. I think it's a case, kind of an ongoing study for 30 years, and just teaching people about the brain. And we're talking about, when you said the word grieving, it kind of made it kind of heavy for me, because there are some things that, like my son, there are some things and ways that we have to love on him. We have to love on him differently than the others. Like, I can tell him all day long that you are an amazing son. I love you. You're awesome. And it kind of hits him a little bit, but it doesn't hit him quite the same way as if I was to grab him and just squeeze the heck out of him. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'll just.
He's a sensory kid. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Like, for me, I'm not a hugger. Like, I'm not a hugger at all. My love language is literally words of affirmation, and that's my primary.
Me too.
Yeah. But when my son came out and he needed that from me, I am a hugger now, but mostly just to him, which is weird, right? Because I'm okay giving hugs, but for him, it's like, that's our thing. And, you know, as we get older, everything we're talking about, I keep fast forwarding with my kids. I'm like, what is Gideon going to be like when he's 40? Is there going to be a change? And not that what he's going through now is negative, or even someone that's neurodivergent, but I would like to believe, Dr. Christina, that there's, and I don't know, I'm not a scientist, but I would like to believe that there are some things in our brain, by way of miracle, or by way, I'm not saying that anybody with any of these things are at a deficit, because I think that's furthest from the truth, because a lot of the kids I work with were crazy intelligent. Mm-hmm. Probably smarter than me, to be honest with you. They're probably a lot smarter than me, but some maybe as a focus issue, some maybe there are certain triggers that we have to stay away from. But I want to believe that by the way of neuroplasticity and the area of the brain, that there are things that can be done. And I'll share this story. I hope I'm not taking too long on this. My brother had 7 strokes. 2 blood clots, one in the midbrain and one in the cerebellum. So that created some major complications in his care. Long story short, he's fully coherent, although he's bedridden. He doesn't have vocal capabilities. We have a trach and a peg, full care, 24-hour care. But I asked him, do you want to be put in the list for the Neuralink? And we don't know what that is going to look like. Mm-hmm. But he can't speak verbally, but he does thumbs up, thumbs down. He blinks his eyes, nods his head. But I have this crazy belief that one day because I'm a firm believer in miracles. I think you and I are in the same fabric in terms of believers, and I have this firm belief that one day that there will be a crazy miracle where he'll be given access to those parts of his brain again, where he can function. I don't know. I'm a firm believer in that. But have you seen any miracles? And I know we're shifting a little bit away from the neurodivergent, but have you seen any miracles in respect of, maybe you've done some treatment with children or teenagers where there's just some major breakthroughs in their life through your therapy or anything? Have you witnessed anything like that where just radical miracles in your practice?
That's a good question. I don't know that I have seen what I would necessarily consider to be radical miracles in the therapy that I've done. Though I have seen some really significant, I've seen some significant shifts in people. I would say probably like the most impactful experience that I had was working. I had mentioned, working at the foster care shelter. I'm thinking of one client in particular who had gone through just some really, really horrific abuse, that I don't even like. There's a term called vicarious trauma that a lot of therapists are very familiar with, where essentially you kind of take on the trauma that another person has gone through. And that's something that, a lot of mental health professionals are subject to, because we spend a lot of time listening to other people's problems and listening to their stories and things like that. So when I was working in this shelter, that was definitely the most intense job that I've ever had, because I was working with kids that had gone through some kids that had gone through really horrific periods of abuse. And this one client, a little girl, had every form of abuse, physical, sexual, mental, had been neglected, just all kinds of things, had exposure to drugs and violence and all of these things, and came into the shelter at the age of 5 years old, having lived through all of these experiences that I had never experienced personally in my lifetime, in my mid-20s then at that point. And, and I think trauma impacts everybody in a different way. With a lot of the kids that I worked with, it really resulted in a very significant insecure attachment to people, and a lot of mistrust of people, because understandably, the people that are supposed to protect you are not protecting you. There's everything, there's no order, there's no routine, there's no schedule, everything is chaotic. You're not safe in any situation, you're being violated in various ways. And so, a lot of kids would come into the shelter with a diagnosis of what was called reactive attachment disorder, essentially saying these kids, not that it was necessarily impossible for them to attach to other people, but that there had just been so much trauma that they just couldn't, or, really, really struggled with that. And this client in particular, and I had this with a couple of clients, this client was at our shelter for a very long time, because of her behavior. And, when you're trying to, the shelter was trying to connect kids to foster homes, essentially, was what we were looking for. And whether that be, can we find an extended family member that they can live with? That was always plan A would be to connect them with somebody in their family. But, in this case, that was really difficult to find, because there was a lot of just crime and abuse within this little girl's family. But then, as a result of everything, had a lot of really significant behavioral and regulation difficulties. And so this was not an easy child to work with, and could get violent and, destructive, and, there's not necessarily like a lot of foster homes that are just like lining up for that. So I worked with her for a very long time. I think she was in the shelter for about 1.5 years, which is that's a very long period of time.
That's a long time.
Yeah. So, but we developed a really good relationship, and she was able to, I would like to believe, grow to trust me, and we were able to process through some of the experiences that she had gone through. And eventually we were able to connect her with an aunt, a blood relative, biological aunt that was outside and out of contact with the rest of the family that was, had their legal issues. And she ended up being able to go and live with this aunt. And once they leave the shelter, I don't really know what happens to them from there. But I just saw such a tremendous growth in her, and in her, the way that by the time she left, she was not aggressive, she was not violent, she was able to connect in with her body and talk about her feelings. She was affectionate with me and with others around her, where she had been very much not that way before. So I would say, I would consider that a miracle, but it was like 1.5 year miracle, right? It wasn't something that just like happened overnight. And I would say truthfully that, the miracle really, like, I didn't feel like there was anything that I did that was super special, other than I was just a consistent figure for her. But she had to be the one to work through all of that. And she had to come, find that regulation in her body and be able to, find herself able to connect and attach to somebody at 5 years old. And she was able to do that. So I'd like to believe that the rest of, her life from there has been pretty good. I don't know for sure, but, that's my hope and prayer for her.
I'm pretty sure it is. And I know you're just doing your job, but I'll tell you this. I don't know if you know how, I'm just speaking from my heart, but I don't know if you know how extremely valuable the work that you do. I don't know how to disconnect my emotion, because I'm listening to your story, but it just took me back to my daughter. Mm-hmm. When we got her, she was 1.5, and she used to have these fat cheeks. So she would stick food in her mouth, she would eat, and then she would keep it in her mouth all day. And then every once in a while I would see her, and then we figured out what she was doing. She was storing food, just storing food in her cheeks. Because at 1.5, she learned how to survive not knowing where her next meal is going to come from. Mm-hmm. And it took a lot of therapy to get her to understand, no, you're going to get food. Don't worry, just eat it. And that was all made possible through, obviously, therapy, play therapy, the work that you do. And it's powerful. Like, at 5 years old, and what's funny, not funny, wrong choice of words. The traumatizing thing is that the older they get, it's harder to get them placement. Mm-hmm. Yeah. A lot, very hard. And so,
yeah, we had a lot of teenagers there, and then then there was also like a residential program. So like the shelter was meant to be short term. So generally, so it was unusual for this little girl to be there as long as she was. Like most kids were there, maybe some of them were only there for a few days or a few weeks. Some up to maybe like 3 to 6 months. But then there was a residential treatment facility, and that was full of teens, and the majority of them were in the foster care system, because they just kept bouncing from foster home to foster home, or then they were getting placed in group homes and then getting kicked out of group homes. So yeah, there's definitely a huge need, still to this day, in that community.
Do you see a silver lining or a light at the end of the tunnel in regards to what we're talking about? Because I think for us, if it wasn't for family stepping in, I don't know if my daughter today would. I'm not saying it's us. God bless us with that opportunity, but one of the biggest hurdles is the family structure. And I know we're getting to a social issue now, but do you see in your practice, do you see any light at the end of the tunnel when it comes to family support and what we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, so conversations and education facilitating like what mental health conditions are like. So understanding mental health conditions, understanding anxiety and depression, understanding neurodivergence, because a lot of these, looking back now, this was early on in my training, and I just didn't even have the level of education that I did, that I do now. But a lot of the kids, looking back, that were in the foster care system, they were neurodivergent, and their behavioral struggles that they were having and their regulation struggles that they were having were oftentimes a result of there being there was an overstimulation, or there was a sensory need or something like that. So I would say, having there be more resources around education and training and awareness of what some of these things look like, and having the right supports in place and the right accommodations in place, that's going to help just not only the individuals, but then the family unit, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the parent now knows, oh, okay, I have an autistic child, and they have a very intense sensitivity to noise. Yeah. Right. Well, I know that, and I know, okay, whenever I run the vacuum cleaner, let's say, that's a noise that's a very barrier aversive noise. Because I don't know too many people that like the sound of a vacuum cleaner.
You're bringing back trauma from 1982.
For them, if we're talking about a kid that has a really high, a high sensory sensitivity, noises can actually physically feel painful for some people. So, if I, was a mom with an autistic child who had a strong aversion to vacuums, then if I knew that, I could either, okay, well, I'm going to vacuum when they're not in the home, or I'm going to give them a lot of warning and heads up of, hey, I need to vacuum the living room. Where would you like to be? Maybe they get a choice of noise canceling headphones or ear protection, or maybe they get to go play outside during that time. And that's just a very small example of that. But I think if this parent doesn't even know that their child has, sensory sensitivities around sound, or maybe doesn't know that they're autistic, and all they know is every time I turn, the vacuum cleaner on, my kid freaks out, and then they start destroying things, and then they're they're freaking out for no reason.
They're right? Demon possessed.
A lot of, I just think then there can be there's just so much confusion around that. So I think, having there be education and training around that, and having a spot for, just a place, which I'm seeing this growing, for there to just be support groups and communities where parents can reach out to other parents, or have a support from a professional, right? So whether that be working with their child's therapist or something along those lines, where they can ask questions, where they can, learn, their own, how to help their kid develop, regulation and coping skills and things like that. So I think that I would say ultimately, to me, it comes down to breaking the stigma around mental health and around neurodivergence and around, just everything, really. And just being able to have open dialogue around it.
I think we have about $2,000 worth of noise canceling headphones in my house.
Fantastic.
At least $2,000, because we have the Sonys, we have the my wife has the Beats, but my son, and there's a point to the story, but we went to I forget where we went to the zoo, the Oregon Zoo, and my wife was like, "I'll be right back." So she comes back with this backpack, and it's got all these fidget spinners, these fidget toys, and the zoo provides families with kids. You got yeah. So yeah, and then he got a noise canceling headphones, And I'll tag you in a picture because it was so cool, Dr. Christina. My son had his noise canceling headphones on at the zoo, which the zoo provided, because it's very busy there, right? There's a lot of noise, a lot of things just going and happening. But my son sat down in front of this aquarium, and this seal came right up to my son, sat right in front of him, and just looked at him. And he has his headphones on. I'll tag you in a picture. But I will agree with education and getting rid of that stigma. And this is a funny story, but it's not so funny. It's funny now that I'm older, but I used to have asthma as a kid. I think I still have asthma, but I think I coughed it out. That's my joke. I coughed it out.
Yeah.
My dad, if you could go back in time, Dr. Christina, and if you were my advocate, my dad would be in jail right now, because when I used to have asthma attacks, my dad used to like slap me in the back. He'd say, cough it out, cough it out. Mm-hmm. And they didn't know. I mean, they knew I had asthma, but they didn't know, hey, you should probably give your son an inhaler or a nebulizer. They gave me this nasty mucus colored medicine in a glass of, I used to hate it. But the education back then was not like what it is today. Mm-hmm. And I agree. Getting the resources, right, and letting people know, obviously the stigma, I think I kind of approached that in the beginning where, you know, I said some terms that I was using as a kid because that's what we were taught, and whether it was wrong, bad, obviously it's bad today. Now, are there resources that you would recommend anybody, like a website or something they can go to, like get information or connect with people, Facebook groups, or I don't know, X or Twitter groups? Is there anything that, off the top of your mind, that you can recommend people to educate themselves, if you will?
You know, I don't know that I have anything that comes like super specific, like right to the top of my mind, but I will say that I mean, the internet is a vast place, right? So I would say that, especially now with so many people being connected on various aspects of social media, that there's a lot that is out there. Now, I think that, you know, anybody can create content, right? So I think that when it comes to, I think we need to be very selective and, you know, around what we take as truth, and what we adopt as, you know, and taking in like the right kind of information. But, you know, I would say, and this may be, I would say state specific. So I'm in the United States, I'm in the Midwest, and I think there's different state resources and things like that. I know, so for example, when I was living, I grew up in California, and I would say like there was a very large focus on identifying like early developmental needs. So I actually worked as I was called a child development specialist, and I worked with like these were regional centers. So being able to identify like early delays. So like if there was like a speech delay or a fine motor skills delay or a gross motor skills delay, these kids, babies, from like the age of 0 to 3 were given services free of charge. They were state funded, physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy. And that was great. There was a really large emphasis on that. So I would say for kids, especially young kids, you know, that there may be some of that available in the States. To be honest, I don't really think that there's that level of accessibility here in Iowa. I haven't. It's at least not, if there are some services, but it's definitely not as well known or widespread as what I experienced in Southern California. But I would say the entry point where a lot of people start out is like with their, like if I'm thinking kids specifically, things will generally start out like with your pediatrician, right? Like a parent. Mm-hmm. Generally, if there's a concern that they have, they're generally going to first bring that to like a pediatrician. So I would say, you know, to me, like, so as a psychologist, I would love for there to be a lot more cohesion between like the medical community and like the mental health community. because there's this, for whatever reason, we have decided that it's appropriate to separate like our body from our brain and our emotions, and that just does not make sense to me, because everything all works and functions together, and they influence each other and impact each other. But I would say, starting with like, I would just say as a parent, like, ask questions. If you have a concern, talk to your doctor. If they're not giving you the answers that you're looking for, or they're dismissive of your concerns, to like not be afraid to be an advocate for your child, and to not be afraid to seek out other resources. And yes, there's, whether it be on Facebook or on Twitter or on Instagram. I know Facebook, for example, has a huge number of, support groups and communities and things like that. And some are better than others, I'm sure, but that is definitely, especially, resources where there are other parents that have experienced the same thing. I think that can be a great way, to kind of find some support, and resources, and finding things, you're not having to reinvent the wheel. If other parents have gone through something similar with their kids and they found some answers. So that was kind of a long trailing.
My wife put up something to kind of help us along. She said Easter seals. That's what we did with our son, and they offered resources for helping families identify and get resources that they would need. So yeah, so she agreed. Pediatrician is a good place to start. That's probably a no-brainer.
Yeah, and I will say that, like, so most primary care doctors are going to be like, they're like kind of the entry point, right? And then they refer out to different specialists. And just as an example, so for here in Iowa, the city that's closest to me, Iowa City, there's a big university there. That's where Caitlin Clark went to school. And the University of Iowa is also a hospital. It's a research hospital. So, they have primary care doctors, but they're housed within, the vast majority of like the other medical fields and populations. And there are, psychologists, psychiatrists, neuropsychologists that they do provide referrals to there. So if you happen to be in an area where there is kind of like a larger like university hospital or something like that, then that can be a really great entry point to get referrals then to more specialized, services and supports.
You mentioned something earlier about, and I'm using a word of disconnect between medical and what you do. Is there an actual, what is the word? I don't know the word. Like, does one think they're better than the other, or is there, if I'm a medical doctor and I come to you, like, is there kind of like a hierarchy in that sense? I know you mentioned something a little bit about like they're separated, right? Like the brain and the body, or does that exist where one thinks they're better than the other, or one is different? I don't understand that reference. I think it's
yeah, I mean, I'm sure that there are certain people on both sides that think that they're better. But I just think that they're, my experience has been, I mean, I haven't been like shut down personally by like a doctor or a psychiatrist before. Though I know many who have. I mean, I know many, mental health providers that have tried to do a consultation with, with a psychiatrist or with a medical doctor, and were, kind of dismissed. But I just think like the training and education that we get is so different, right? Like, I mean, as a mental health provider and going through graduate school as a psychologist, I didn't get any sort of training around the body at all, other than I learned about like, kind of like a basic like human physiology class, and I had to learn about the different parts of the brain. But I mean, I didn't really learn anything about like the body and medical conditions, and how medical conditions can impact our mental health, or can impact our cognitive functioning, or things like that. So I just think that there's really a disconnect. There's just like the training is not holistic, I guess would be the best way to put it. In the medical field, you're taught very specific things. In the mental health field, you're taught very specific things. And there is such an overlap between them. But I think it's kind of funny, because I think that most people can like see that there is overlap, but the educational fields have not intersected. at least at this point.
There are things that happen to us physically or medically, I would imagine, that directly affect our mental health, right? Obviously diet and nutrition too. So like in your guys, in your company, your services, I wrote it down, but I can't find it.
That's fine.
On your website, you guys offer there's four key parts, right? Obviously spiritual, the mental. What's the other two?
Well, so body, mind, and spirit.
Body, mind, and spirit. Sorry.
That's our slogan. Basically, we've got like the three little rings, and that's our logo is body, mind, and spirit. And the name of my company, our company, is Holistic Resources. And I was very intentional with that because, you know, now I don't have like the medical training, right? But I have my sister's a nutritionist. I have a lot of, relationships with others that are in the medical field, that are in the, nutritional field, alternative medicine, things like that. And also those that are really like body centered and body focused, right? Like whether that be Reiki or yoga or meditation or things like that. And so I think just, for me, knowing how important, if there's one part of our system that is out of alignment, like all of the areas are going to suffer, right? If there's something in our body that is not working properly, then that's going to impact our mental health, and by default that can absolutely impact our spiritual health and wellness, right? If we're not able to optimally function the way that we want to. So that's been, I would say, something that I try to be so integrating in my work, even as, I'm the feelings doctor and the brain doctor, and I focus on those parts of it, but I regularly will talk to my clients about like, well, what is your sleep like? What is your, or if I work mostly with kids, right, in therapy, so I'll talk to their parents. Well, what is their nutrition like? What do they eat during the day? Are they drinking water? Are they getting enough sleep? What do they do for, like, are they coming home from school and then sitting on like video games for the next 4 hours? Or are they in sports? Or are they outside? Do they have friends? Do they have a hard time making friends? There's just so many factors that, to me just go above and beyond, or that can, I would say, like, help explain why there might be certain struggles that are going on. So I'm always looking at, some of the physical things, and alongside the emotional things, and then spiritual health, I would say, doesn't have to be from like a religious standpoint, right? But just, I believe, we all have a spirit. We all have this part of our being that is not, our body is just our body. I don't think our body is what makes us who we are, right? There's an entity that we are that exists outside of that. And so, finding various ways to be able to foster and nurture that, whether that be through, a specific, religious or spiritual practice, but it doesn't have to be. But to me, it's about like kind of just fostering that, I would say that what makes you who you are, and what is your drive, and what do you see being like why are you here, right? I think that's a question that, like, what is your purpose, right? Because I think that that's a question that so many of us, I think all of us have asked at some point, why am I here? Like, what is my bigger purpose? So, all of that, it's also connected from my opinion and in my experience. And so I feel like, we do a disservice to ourselves and to our clients if we aren't working to integrate all of that and look at all aspects of that.
Now, what happens if someone believes in a body and mind, but they don't necessarily give into the spirit side of the...
Sure, that's fine. I would say for me, like, I meet people where they're at. And if and I have had clients that come in that have a very specific, like, religious affiliation, and they want to incorporate certain aspects of their religion or their spiritual beliefs into our sessions. And if they want to do that, then I allow that. And if they don't, then that's fine too. So I would say, like, I don't necessarily feel limited by, wherever a person is at in their journey. I'm always trying to, that meeting them where they're at, where are they at, and what are their goals, and what are they looking for? And then I can help them take steps from there.
Speaking of the spiritual aspect of your company, Azusa Pacific is a very spiritual school.
It is. I was very intentional in choosing that. So it's interesting because I was raised Christian, non-denominational Christian. I was in the same church fellowship for really my whole life. The fellowship eventually kind of imploded in itself a handful of years ago, which is like a whole other story. But so I grew up in that fellowship, but I was always in public school. And I went to public school from elementary all the way through my undergraduate program was all public school. And Azusa Pacific is a private school, which, first of all, the degree that I chose, my degree is a doctorate of psychology. It's a PsyD degree. And, I don't know if it's still this way, but at the time, you could only get that degree through a private school. Interesting. It wasn't available. Like I was in like the Los Angeles area. It wasn't available like at UCLA, for example. It wasn't available at where I had gone for undergraduate. And I think part of it is because it was considered like a professional degree or a specialized degree. It was put into it wasn't a PhD. So PhDs tend to be very research based. And so universities will fund, PhD programs because there's a big research component. My degree, the PsyD, was much more clinical. So it was designed for people who knew that they wanted to be like a mental health professional, that they wanted to be a therapist, they wanted to work in a clinical role. So basically, all of the schools that I applied to were private schools. But I really liked Azusa Pacific University because it did have those spiritual and that more kind of Judeo-Christian undertones to it. But it was an open, at least their graduate program. I think their undergrad program might not have been this way, but their graduate program was an open enrollment program. So essentially that meant, you did not as a student have to align with Judeo-Christian beliefs to go to the school. However, all of the professors that were there, they had to sign a statement of faith in order to be a professor there.
I'm very impressed with their mission statement. Like, whether people agree with Christian values or not, the fact that there are universities that are willing to put their mission statement on the front page that boldly, it's kind of rare. Like, and a lot of people may not agree with their mission statement, but I personally do, and I appreciate that they put it out there. It's like right there, So, yeah, that's a great school. But so with the research base, now I don't know if this term is relevant to what we're talking about. Does that include? I wrote this down. I can't remember where I put this in a conversation, but systems-based approach. Is that related to what we're talking about?
Well, so I would say, the specific program that I was in, so this was part of my reason also for wanting to go to, why I chose Azusa Pacific, because I applied to a variety of different schools. I got accepted into all of them. And I'm not saying that for like bragging rights, but I'm saying that because, I would just say to give a lot of credit to Azusa Pacific because it really did stand out to me. And that was, the program that I was in, they ran everything through it was a family systems approach. So essentially, what that means is that we were always kind of looking at and analyzing and exploring, like, it's not just the client that comes into a room, it is like all of the systems that they're a part of as well, right? So got like their little like microsystem, which is their, nuclear family. But then you have all of these like larger kind of macro systems outside of that too. So, right, like what about their education? What about their social group? What about, if they are aligned with a certain like religious affiliation, so their church group or their temple or their mosque or whatever, other kind of spiritual practice that they are part of. And then you have all of the like, well, where do they live, right? Kind of like the environment that they're in, the city that they're in, what are the resources like? And so that was honestly a big part of what helped foster my trajectory into the whole like holistic, body, mind, spirit, because I'm like, oh my gosh, like we have to look at all of these various systems to help kind of figure out like what is really going on for somebody. And then I went internal with it too, right? Well, it's all of these systems outside, but it's also all of our systems inside that are impacting us. So, that was a really, I would say, I think a pretty unique part of the program. And that really drew me to the program when I went through it.
Well, and you talking about all the different components and the microsystems. At 2019, my wife and I, we helped open a drug and alcohol rehab in Hawaii. And one of the things that we were very strong about was it's not just about the individual that's getting recovery, because if he doesn't have a family system in place of some sort, whether it's Hanai family or organic, like, bloodline family, they're just going to come back. They're going to end up, relapsing and being admitted to another center. So that family dynamic, that family component is very important. I totally agree with that. And I think the educational choice was, my wife and I, we were researching, we're like, wow, this school is pretty legit, hardcore. And she said that with the way that they post their mission statement, you know what you're getting. There's no hidden agendas, exactly. Now, obviously that hasn't impeded your progress in terms of your educational choice. Now, your previous degrees were with, it was in the state of California, right?
Yeah. So I went to a public school. I went to a state school, Cal State Northridge, for my undergraduate degree. Mm-hmm.
Well, I will say, are you going to get another degree anytime soon?
If it were totally up to me, maybe. My husband probably has other things to say about that, because I love learning. So like, I'm one of those people, if I could get paid to be in school for forever, I would probably do that. But what I will say is, I think that I have to do continuing education units, right? So in order to maintain licensure, you have to basically like stay with the times, and you have to stay like up to date with, with the research and the practices and things like that. So I love that aspect of it, so I do really look for opportunities to learn and educate myself and grow in, my practice, whether that be like a new therapy technique or whether that be learning more about like a specific population or, anything, or learning more about, I attended a conference that was all about psychopharmacology. So all about like, the medication side of things, because that's like that's a whole other thing.
Well, can you explain the psychopharmacology? Can you explain that term?
Yeah, well, so that's essentially, so in the field of mental health, that would be essentially any sort of medication that is used to treat a mental health condition. So whether that be like an anti-anxiety medication or an antidepressant or like a stimulant medication for ADHD. And, I had to take a psychopharmacology class in my graduate program, but it was like, one class. And the vast majority of the clients that I have are on medication or have been on medication at some point, in their life. And, so that's an area that I would like to continue to get education around. So yes, but I feel like I get that education through my continuing education units as well. And I get to be pretty selective in what I choose for those. And so I look for conferences, and I look for things in areas that I just know that I don't have, that expertise in, that I want to learn a little bit more about.
My wife wants me to go back to school, and there's several things, but I told her, but we'll see, because there's so much things that we're doing right now, and it's a huge commitment. But I do believe in osmosis. I do believe in attaching myself to people that are educated, obviously. So I will say, outside of you've got a nice list of degrees, and I had another guest. I think she had 3 PhDs. Her name was Dr. Battle. She was a UN ambassador, and she does a whole bunch of things. Then my cousin Terry, she's also a clinical psychologist. She's the first one I had as a guest. But my uncle,
to look at that interview, I didn't get a chance to see that one.
Yeah, it was okay. I was still learning how to. It was weird because she's family, but I didn't tell everybody she was family. So I tried to make it like I knew somebody with street cred. But her dad, before he passed away, he had 5 PhDs.
Wow.
Yeah, and they were real. They weren't like they weren't honorary.
Yeah, not the honorary.
Yeah, not the honorary. Yeah. So, I'll tell you this: knowing Josh, he'll make the big dollars while you go and get your second, third PhDs.
If I could, what I would, if I were to pursue something, I would potentially pursue something in nutrition. So that's what my sister is a nutritionist. Or I would potentially, there is like a postmaster or a postdoctoral master's program that I could get in psychopharmacology. So in some of the states now, so people get confused a lot of times between a psychologist and a psychiatrist. So I'm a psychologist, and psychologists, like, we're like the feelings doctors. So we're the ones that do therapy. Psychiatrists are medication providers. So they, as a psychiatrist, you go through med school, and then you take a track and you specialize in medication for mental health conditions. But there is a growing body of individuals that are licensed psychologists that then are going on to get a postgraduate master's in psychopharmacology, and then they are becoming prescribing psychologists. So that would be something that would be, like, in an ideal world, would be really cool to be able to do, but it's a lot of work.
You would have a lot of friends like, hey, hit me up. I want some. You have any extra Vicodin? People be hitting you up. You be the drug dealer of the town. Like,
well, I don't know, but I don't know, because by the time I would finally be able to prescribe medication, it would be probably 5-10 years from now. It's a big commitment. But I don't know, maybe at some point. I mean, I definitely think I have a love for learning. So I think that that's the most important thing, is just to continue to seek that out, and however I can get that. So maybe it doesn't need to translate to another degree, though.
So, why nutrition? I'm just curious. Like, why does that fascinate you?
Well, because of I would say because of the body aspect of it. And I would say, I have seen, just so within like the neurodivergent population in particular, I've seen just a very large segment of that population that have some sort of like food sensitivities or allergies. So I see a lot of people with like co-occurring like celiac disease, where they're like allergic to gluten, or lactose intolerance, or and even if it's not like a full-on allergy, I see a lot that there are sensitivities to it, which might not necessarily, like, a lot of times, like, the reaction to something is like emotional or behavioral. I worked with a family who they had their kid was in, I think it was in hockey, and great kid, but he would have these like epic meltdowns after hockey practice or games, and they were like, what the heck is happening? And they thought, well, it's like is hockey being too stressful for him? Like, maybe it's just not his thing, And then come to find out, they realized that at the end of every practice and game, they were giving these kids Gatorade. And they found out that on the days that they gave the red Gatorade was the days that this kid was having these huge meltdowns. And so then come to find out, they were able to trace it to the red food dye that was in the Gatorade, specifically the red food dye. He seemed to do okay with the other Gatorades, not that those were any better nutrition wise, but he was having these huge reactions, and that's how it manifested. It wasn't, like a food allergy per se, like he wasn't breaking out in a rash or hives or having like an anaphylactic reaction or anything like that, but he was having a huge behavioral like emotional regulation meltdown in the middle of all of that. So I see that a lot within the neurodivergent community, that there's like a lot of like food sensitivities, and I also see a lot of autoimmune conditions. And I feel like that's not a coincidence. I feel like there's some sort of like a connection there. So that part is fascinating for me. And so that would be, that's something. And I do try to do like a lot of research around that, just kind of on my own too, of kind of trying to connect the dots around like what all is contributing, right, to what is going on for these people.
I 100% agree that they are connected. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I do believe that I believe that conspiracies are birthed out of things that are hidden. That's what I believe. They may not always be true, but I do believe that food, of course, does affect a lot of the things mentally and obviously physically, but my wife will attest that same thing. Red dye number 5. I don't know what it is. It's some magical sauce that causes some crazy reactions. My kids get rashes and all kinds of weird things. As a matter of fact, my sensory processing disorder, my son that has that, he gets some serious reactions when he drinks anything like Powerade, the red Powerade. Actually, I don't think he can drink any Powerade now because of that. And my wife can probably confirm that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I see overlaps, whether that be with like food colorings or with sugar. Like I see like a much higher level of like sensitivity to sugar, and whether that be like even just like regular sugar, but like artificial sweeteners too, that there tends to just be, a much stronger reaction. So that, to kind of bringing it back to like the holistic approach, to me, that's like, when I have a kid that comes into my office, my virtual office, that is having like, a behavioral problem, right? I'm like, well, gosh, like that could be like 1,000 different things. And it's probably not just, and I can guarantee it's not just that this kid is just like, no kid like wants to be in trouble and wants to be a behavior problem, right? So to me, there's always more to the story than that. And some of it may be regulation and learning how to like, control your emotions and control your behaviors and things like that. But I mean, if I come to find out that this kid is like, being fed like a really like highly processed diet and is, coming to school, is going to school like jacked up on like, I don't know, like Pop-Tarts and Cocoa Puffs, and then, having these epic meltdowns at school, right? I'd be like, yeah, I could see that. Like they are jacked up on sugar and, and artificial ingredients and processed foods. And that's just not going to be great for anyone's system.
Have you ever heard of the carnivore diet?
I have heard of it. Yeah. My mom's actually been dabbling with that more recently too. Yeah.
Now, we're not offering medical advice or nutritional advice, but I will say that when my wife and I did the carnivore diet, it was more of a kind of a desperate, eliminate everything and let's just figure this out. And so I will say the carnivore diet is legit for us. Anybody that's listening, go get your own medical advice and nutritional advice. But it's interesting that you eliminate all those variables, nutritionally speaking. Mm-hmm. You wipe the slate and you start from just straight red meat, salt and water. It's amazing how the things I learned about my body, that I don't need to drink a Coca-Cola. I don't need to have potato chips, you really don't.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something I want to learn more about. Now, I think it's kind of kooky though. You know, if carnivores on one side, we got vegans on the other side, I think it's kind of kooky where they kind of attack each other on social media. To me, it's like, if I'm a vegan, I don't want to make food that resembles an animal. Like, I'm not going to have fake tuna, right? But I also have friends that are carnivores on the other side where they make fake bread, or, you know, it's like, either you're going to eat it or you don't, but don't pretend to eat it by making fake bread. They make carnivore bread. No, just eat. Don't call it bread. Just, you know. But if you haven't tried it, I would recommend, obviously research it, but I recommend and look into it and see. Because nutritionally, I think it's a very interesting diet. I think I'm actually writing my notes down on my menu. It is very restrictive, though, I will say. And you said something about sugars earlier. My wife blames everything on sugars. If you're having an attitude, that's too much sugar. If you're itchy, too much sugar, you know. Here's why she put up, it causes irritability. No Pop-Tarts in our house.
That's good. No Pop-Tarts in your house.
Bruh, no pop. Well, it's so crazy because it's cheap, right? Like, you can go to...
Well, yeah, and that's, then we go back to kind of like when we were talking about this with the telehealth part of it, right? Or with testing, like what is accessible to people, right? So I would, the things that are the most accessible to people and that tend to be convenience foods and tend to be processed foods. And
so like, what foods are in your kitchen right now? I meant to ask that earlier. What foods do you have in your pantry, in your kitchen?
Oh, well, we have a variety because my husband's very picky. I tend to eat healthier than he does. So I try to be really mindful of like what I eat, because I try to be really aware of like how my body responds, but not just my body, but how does my brain respond, and how do my emotions respond? Because I'm one that, I would just say that if I'm going to have a reaction to something, it's more like either a mental reaction, like I get brain fog or I'm not as focused, or it's an emotional reaction, like that my regulation skills like go out the window. I'm trying to be really mindful of that, and that's just kind of how I've recognized that my body and my brain act. And so I think, it's very individualized. So, like you said, I would never tell anybody, well, everybody needs to be on XYZ diet, or even I would say within like the neurodivergent community, for example, I did say that, a large number of the autistic individuals that I work with have food sensitivities around like gluten products and dairy products, but not all of them do. And so, just to kind of have like a blanket statement of like, well, everybody needs to do, XYZ, I don't think really is the most appropriate thing. But I do think being, very mindful and paying attention, and then teaching your kids to pay attention too. Well, how do you feel after that? Like, how does your body feel? But also like, how do you feel like emotionally? Like, how do you feel mentally? Do you have like mental clarity? Do you have brain fog? Are you like what your wife said, like, do you feel irritable after this? Like, that is a big, I would say, telltale sign, if something is if something's really not like agreeing with your system. But I think we're so disconnected from our bodies that, we don't connect things like that most of the time, unless we're really looking for it, right? We think of it as something else that's going on. Not to say that there aren't other factors, right? Like if I get into an argument with my husband, that's going to make me irritable too, right? It's maybe that is not like this extra cup of coffee that I had. But I think, all of that can come into play.
I think we can all agree that processed sugars are not good for you, right? Yeah. And we can all agree that processed foods in general are not good for you. And let's be very clear. We process food at home. We just make it healthy processed food, right? When we make it a certain way. My daughter, since we've been in Oregon, she has a garden. She makes homemade bread. Honey, help me out. What else does she make? She makes homemade everything. She makes homemade butter. We would fit in Iowa. We would fit in your hometown for sure. But
You could. There's a lot of, yeah, I would say, a lot of there's I think that it's fostered to kind of, grow your own food and things like that here, or, that there's local farms. So people can go, like, whether that be like a, I can't remember the terminology for it, but basically it's a share, like you get like a fruit and veggie share.
yeah,
Like agriculture, it's a CSA. I can't remember what the acronym stands for though.
my wife knows. She's going to chime in probably.
Okay.
Not crop share. What is it called? Crop share?
Is it? It's something like that. But I've done those before where, there's a farmer that has, they have an excess of something. And so and then where your food's coming from. So yeah, I think, but that's an aspect of it. So I think, like looking at what you're eating, but, other aspects I would say like that can contribute to mental health would be, your sleep, your water intake, how much sunlight you're getting, how much, like what your activity level is like, so I'm always like, my brain is like always firing and going down like so many different like tangents with things, because I'm always trying to look at, what could be contributing to XYZ, whatever that is, right? I just, I don't ever want to get too much like tunnel vision into like, well, this is like the root cause of something, right? Because in most of the experiences that I've had, it's usually more than just like one thing contributing. So, and she said herd shares. Yeah. So there are like, so in Iowa too, like people will sell, like you can get like a whole cow, or like a family can go, or a couple families can go in on a cow, and you get like it's distributed. And again, that's just, when you know like where your food is being sourced from, I think, so yeah, I just think there's so much that goes into our overall health and wellness, that I'm always looking for those aspects too, right? Because if I'm working with somebody on like emotion regulation, and a factor is that they're getting really, let's say that I have a client, a teenager that is getting really, really anxious. I've had this before. I had a teen client who was getting really anxious at school around a certain time of the day. And he was attributing it to a specific class. And well, it's maybe this class and it's this teacher. And I was like, well, that's, valid. It definitely could be that, or that could be a factor. And we kind of explored that, and like, but wasn't feeling unconfident about the class materials, or wasn't, felt like the relationship with the teacher was okay, didn't have a problem with any of the other students. Well, come to find out, I was like, well, okay, so like when in the day is this? And I found out that this was the class right before lunch.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, I was like, well, what do you have for breakfast? Found out that this kid was not eating breakfast in the morning. So by the time it was like, I think it was like third period or whatever, but by the time they got to that class and it's right before lunch, they were so hungry that their blood sugar was dropping, and it was causing, when your blood sugar drops, that can trigger symptoms of, it can mimic anxiety. It can feel almost like you're having like a panic attack. And I found out that was the vast majority of what was going on for this kid. And so I had them start, I was like, well, okay, so you're not hungry in the morning for breakfast. I tried that. I'm like, can you eat breakfast? And they were like, I'm just not hungry. So I had them start bringing like a snack to school with them. And I'm like, hey, just like something like kind of nonchalant, right? Like a protein bar or something that you could kind of eat in class. That's not going to be a big deal. And their anxiety, like in that particular instance, was almost completely eliminated, because they just were, they had their blood sugar up. So your wife's throwing you under the bus here.
She is. You know what? Hey, that's legit. That's a legit psychological problem, because anybody that reads their Bible knows that there's a very famous story of someone that gave up his birthright just because he was hungry.
That is why. Oh my gosh, he had low blood sugar. That's what was going on.
Exactly.
We have solved it.
But you know what? We're learning, right? Every time a new study comes out. But I'm glad you were able to troubleshoot that, because that's a legit psychological problem for a lot of people, is like not getting the right amount of nutrition at the right amount of time.
But that's a situation though. If I had just been focusing on like the mental health component of it, I would have like been really well, there's got to be something with that class, right? Even though he was like, well, I don't know. He's like, I like the teacher, like the class is fine. I'm competent in the class. Like I'm getting an okay grade. Like I don't have a problem with the students. Like if I was thinking just from a psychological standpoint, I'd be like, nope, like there's got to be something underlying that, right? Like there's something there. But it really was, it was a physiological, like a nutritional aspect. And if I hadn't been open to exploring that, I would have lost it. But it was causing then mental health struggles, because then he was having this anxiety. And then, you know, what can happen is then you get anxiety about getting anxiety, right? So then it was creating like a lot of kind of on top of that mental, like more significant mental health issues. Over something that really was just like as simple as, you know, okay, like just make sure that you get some food in your system, that you need to eat before lunch, like you're getting too hungry, and your blood sugar is really low.
Now, how did the parents feel after that session, or after that was done? How did they feel?
You know, I did that. This was with an older teen, so
okay.
He just did it himself. So I don't know if he really ever told his parents about it. And I trusted him. I mean, he was like, yeah, I'm bringing these things to school now. And he was a trustworthy kid that I believed him, that he said he was doing that, and that he said that it was really helping, So, but I think like any of those factors, right? Like, if we're not getting enough sleep, if we're not being hydrated, if we're not, those all have so much impact, and those things are not, they're not going to like cure like a mental health condition, right? But certainly, I mean, gosh, like if we can find ways to help, I will take anything to kind of help me out, right? So if there's something that I know is going to help me be more focused and be more like in tune with my my regulation and things like that, I would want to know how to what to do for those things.
They may not solve certain psychological issues or problems, but they will cause some. Yeah.
They can.
They will. Absolutely. Did you follow up? Did you hear the story about my daughter the other day?
Well, I kind of heard, and then I was trying to watch like the video that you did, and it wasn't loading for me.
Oh yeah, you have an iPhone, right?
I do.
Yeah, sorry, so sorry. No, I'm just kidding. But because you said water, right? Water. You said water 2 or 3 times, and it kept triggering that day. So my daughter, we went on a trip. As a matter of fact, we were messaging back and forth, and that was one of the trips we took. And my wife found her on the ground. Well, I'm probably over dramatizing everything, but basically my daughter, when I came around up the hill, my wife was yelling for me. She was on the ground, and my wife was just screaming because she was in and out. And but anyways, long story short, it was a hot day. It was 105. We were at 6,000. We were 8,000 to 6,000 feet elevation, and we don't know for sure what it was, because my daughter had another episode that she didn't tell us about, which was similar. But we do know that she didn't drink enough water that day. And that obviously heavily affected, her physical well-being that day. But, Dr. Christine, that was, it was so traumatizing. Like, my wife, like I processed later. I don't know if that's a man thing or a father thing, or my thing was point A to point B, and then once you get home, let's get emotional. And that's just crazy, seeing your kid like that. And when you talk about water, it's like, it's water. Like, what?
Well, what I would say to, if I can get like nerdy again with it, would be like, you were in your like that, when you're like, oh, I got to figure it out now. And then like, I'll process it, like emotionally process it later.
Yeah.
You were in your sympathetic nervous system. So our sympathetic nervous system is like fight or flight, right? That is like, there is a danger, like you got to do what you got to, like, you're like in survival mode, right? You got to do what you got to do. In that moment, you needed to do what you needed to do to like get what you needed for your daughter, right? Like there's no time, like it's not going to do your daughter in that moment any good for you to be totally freaking out, right? But so then like it's like later when we come out of that fight or flight response, that sympathetic nervous system, and we can come back into our parasympathetic nervous system, which is rest and digest. That's where like the kind of deeper level processing comes in. It's a survival mechanism. That's what it's designed for.
You know what's crazy is my wife was very focused as well, but she was very motherly at the same time. And her focus was, and I'm paraphrasing, honey, so my wife is watching, I'm paraphrasing, because it's a whole nother psychological backstory to this too. But her focus was like, hurry up and go call. And because we were in an off-grid location, we had to drive 2 miles down the road just to get a signal.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, I think the second day, my wife and I were discussing that we were not on the same page. Not that we had two different thought processes in terms of as a couple, but more of I think there was a communication portion that we did not connect on. And of course, I shared my feelings, she shared hers. And moving forward, now we understand this is how we're going to operate the next time it happens, because it's so emotionally heavy. We slept hard the next day. We slept hard.
Yeah, I believe it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, your body needed to catch up, right? Like
Yeah.
after it had just expended so much energy. So once you knew that the threat, because I'm assuming then at that point you knew like she was going to be okay, right? That it takes a big toll on our body. So yes, like, so when there are physical things going on, it absolutely can have a significant like impact on our mental health as well. And it can be a delayed effect too, right? Because when we're in like that fight or flight response, that survival mode, like we're not in tune with all of the other kind of residual aspects that are going on, right? And so it's not until we can like come out of that fight or flight response that we really are able to fully process and kind of, and then I would say deal with like the aftermath of whatever that event was too.
You know, I got to ask a question, and I want to be sensitive to time. I had a couple of questions in regards to what's healthy, unhealthy in terms of the psychological. And are you okay on time? Do you need a bathroom break? I have a fancy commercial I can play if we need to take a quick 1 minute break. Are you good on time?
I think that I'm okay for now.
Okay.
But I could if you need a break at any time too, I can take a break too.
No, but I have this nice commercial. Well, actually, that video I played for you, I can play that if you need to take a water break, or you tell me right now, I can play it. We can come back, or we can keep going.
Sure. Let's do it. Let's do the fancy break.
Okay. Fam, we're going to take a quick 30 to 45 second, maybe a minute break to refill our water cups, clear our sinuses, and maybe Christina's going to, go. Well, I'll leave it at that. We'll come back and talk story, and we'll be back in about a minute. Let me find that video. Where is it at? Okay, here we go. Where is it? There it is. All right, we'll be back in about a minute. My daughter made this. I ain't gonna lie. my daughter made this fresh breads. I'm like, my wife is texting me. I'm like, how am I
That's
gonna
why we're like, let's take a break. And
no, no, so I'm like, how am I gonna take a break without sounding rude? I said, you know what? Do you need a break?
that is great. That is great.
So she makes homemade bread from scratch, and it's so good. And I'm not supposed to be eating bread, but you know what? It's only 5 ingredients, not 37 like the one you buy from the stores.
Yep, that is awesome.
I meant to tell you this. You know, Josh, he's so lean. Brother man can eat whatever he wants, right? He could eat anything and get away with it, I'm sure. Yeah. Now, he's former military, correct?
He is, yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm pouring my water.
You're good. You're good.
Have you ever tried Topo Chico?
No.
Oh my gosh, it's so good. Like, I'm not sponsored by them, so I'm not going to promote them, but
I will be Googling it immediately.
it's no sugars.
Like a spark. Is it like a sparkling water, carbonated?
Yeah, I don't know what it is, but we're so addicted to them. And I haven't drank Coke in a year, and I'm so grateful. Now, I do drink other drinks that have sugary stuff, but I don't drink. Coke is really bad for you. It's really, really bad. So, but yeah, Topo Chico, for anybody that's wondering what we're drinking. Here's a question. Are there any, I don't know how, I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this question. So I got shingles when I was 30, I don't know, 35-ish, very young, right? And the doctor told me that typically people that get shingles in a young age, typically it's compromised immune system, and what triggers that sometimes is stress. And I was like, I don't have any stress. Mm-hmm. And he was like, well, think about the things that you're going through. And my eyes were like, oh my God, I am stressed. I'm like, what? And what I did was, there were some very stressful things going on in our marriage, and not anything like divorce type, but just stressful things with our kids. And rather than talk about them or even share them with my wife or with anybody, I would hang on to them, mm-hmm. and I would deal with them later, mm-hmm. not realizing I was carrying this stress. Is there a clinical term, or is there something in your area of expertise that describes what I just explained to you?
I mean, internalizing, repressing,
repressing.
And
okay.
I think that we, and disconnecting, like I mean, at the extreme end of that, I would say like dissociating, which dissociating has kind of like a very like intense, like clinical terminology to it. But I mean, people dissociate all the time. Like you're just disconnecting yourself from like where you are kind of in your present moment. And that's a coping skill for many people, right? Because if you're first of all, if you're in an unsafe environment, right, then and you don't have a way out of that environment, then sometimes the most protective thing to do is to disconnect from it. But I would say, like, as a whole, just, in Western society, especially like in the States, we're essentially socialized to like not be in tune with ourselves. We're not in tune with our emotions, not in tune with our bodies. And so I see very often that anxiety, stress gets manifested in a physical way, because it's, our body and our brain are probably trying to give us signals around the fact that we are anxious or we're stressed out or something isn't right. But we don't necessarily listen very well to those things, or we might not really even kind of be aware enough like of our own internal state to know like what that even, those cues look like. And so sometimes like our body has to get really loud to let us know, that there is something going on. So to get our attention to do something with it. So it's not unusual for me to see anxiety and stress manifested in a very physical format. I would say like headaches are probably the most common thing that I see, that people get like really bad headaches because there's just so much that happens to me. That I store all of my stress and tension like in my shoulders and in my neck, and when that's like tense and tightened and all of that, it's gonna trigger headaches. So Um,
But maybe that's why I have big traps because I store stress up here, you know. Now, in the area of that, what we're talking about, who do you think has more in terms of diagnosing or counseling or offering services? Do you see more men or boys or girls, men and women in that area of internalizing like that?
Yeah, so I mean, and just taking into account that my population, I work mostly with kids and teens, right? So
Yeah.
it's a pretty even split. I mean, I see a pretty even distribution between girls and boys. Um, and I would actually say that, so I do work with adults in like in assessment capacity. So that's a little bit of a different role, but I would say it's pretty evenly split there too. Like I have a pretty equal number of men and women coming to me for assessment.
You said that the body, well, my body was shouting at me, right? So I think I was out of work for 3 weeks. I remember having, because it was on the left side of my head. And although it was physical, I shared this with I think Dr. John as well. I shared that when I had shingles, because I had to stay at home, I really felt like I don't know the best way to describe this. I just felt like I wasn't, not a real man, but I just didn't feel like the man that I should have been. I felt like, man, I can't work. I can't provide for my family. I'm sitting at home and I got to cover all the windows. I'm like a hobbit hiding in a cave and I'm taking this medication and I'm like, what is this medication? Oh, this medication makes me feel good, So, and I had these thoughts of like, nothing crazy, but it's just like, it was just depressing. I felt that little tinge of depression hitting, and it's like, my body definitely spoke to me then after all of that hoarding, that stress, and not dealing with it. And I'm glad I don't have shingles, or I haven't gotten shingles again, but I'm very grateful. Whoever that doctor was that gave me that medication, I'm glad that he gave me some very good guidance, because I think it was Vicodin, or what's the other one?
Like an
He,
oxy something.
Oxy, yeah. He gave me Percocet, and it's like, that made me feel terrible. And then, of course, the Oxy is like, oh, I felt happy. It's like, I'm glad I wasn't addicted to it, but I wasn't on it long enough, or I wasn't using it or abusing it. So,
Sure, yeah.
but I'm very grateful. So, what's the next chapter for you? Do you have anything in the pipeline, chapter-wise, in your practice, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think I had thrown this out like with some other question that you had asked at one point, but I would, ideally, I would like to maybe look at bringing on a couple more providers into my practice. So it's just me right now. And so I'd love to be able to bring on maybe one or two other clinicians. And again, a large part of it is there is just such a need. And I don't want to have to turn anybody away.
Right.
And so, I mean, I held on as long as I could, and I was taking every referral that I could. And, I recently had to stop taking therapy referrals because the testing stuff there's such a high need for that. And I can't do it all. So there's that piece of it. But, again, having another couple of providers that would allow me to maybe step back a little bit, from my clinical role and maybe pursue some of the other things. So I would like to publish some more. I have a couple of book ideas kind of in the queue, I guess, so to speak. So one is around, I would say, like, kind of born out of my own journey and kind of realizing my own my neurodivergence, and so a book kind of geared towards understanding and coming to acceptance and coming to terms with being a neurodivergent individual. And then kind of off of that, there is such, as a psychologist and looking at my profession as a whole, and just our level of education and training around neurodiversity in general, which is not very great. So let me tell you, of really wanting to write a book that is geared towards clinicians, and particularly towards assessors, like so psychologists that are doing testing, to really help, because if you don't really know what you're looking for, like, so particularly for neurodivergence around ADHD and autism, because there's such a wide spectrum, that so much is going missed or undiagnosed, because again, we're looking at everything in such like a narrow box of what, like it has to check off these, these check boxes and in this very specific way. So I'd love to be able to help other psychologists just be able to better recognize, neurodivergent conditions like ADHD and autism that might be like not within like the stereotype, right? So things that are like less stereotypical, or things that might even be kind of like what we consider to be like subclinical, or things that don't quite like meet the threshold diagnostically, but that can still be, disabling for people. So those are some ideas. I'm sure that I would have more. I also I love creative writing, so it would be fun to do some children's books or things like that. So
I've got an idea for you. You want to
you?
hear it?
Yeah.
Let's back up. It's a book title. I don't even know what the subject matter is. I just have an idea. The title of a book I think would be cool would be Neurodivergent History Makers. It could be like a collection of stories of people that have changed the world, maybe culture. I don't know. Just was thinking, man.
Yeah.
Neurodivergent History Makers.
That is very cool. That is an awesome book title.
I just want 1%. When you hit your millions, I just ask for 1%.
That sounds good. Good.
And we are documented. So, ladies and gentlemen,
it's live. That's a binding contract, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, things like that. I love speaking. I love, coming on podcasts. I've thought about doing my own podcast. I've thought about, a lot of things. I mean, I think just, I love what I do, and I love learning, and I love teaching. And so I would say anything that I can kind of do to, again, kind of just spread awareness and helping to continue this conversation and breaking the stigma around, any sort of mental health condition. That's why I really appreciate you have all kinds of people on your podcast that I really appreciate that you've had a number of psychologists on here, because we need that. We need there to be, I would say, open conversation and discussion around, our mental health, because just honestly, we are in a mental health crisis in this country right now.
Yeah.
For a variety of reasons. But I think, it's not doing any of us any benefit to not be talking about it.
Can we talk about that? So you said that we're in a mental health crisis. Can you give me some contributors to that? Why is that? Why do you say that we are in a mental health crisis?
Well, there's a lot of division in this country. I mean, I don't think that's not like a shock to anybody.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that divisiveness is really hard. Conflict is really hard for people. Like, we don't really know, my opinion is that we don't really know how to handle conflict appropriately. Because I don't think that it's a problem for people to have different beliefs. Like, that's really not a problem. Like, we are, I feel like there's a reason why there is diversity. I think we need diversity. If we don't have diversity, we fall into groupthink and confirmation bias, right? Like, we are in an echo chamber. And so I think that there's a lot of benefit to being challenged, in our beliefs and being and needing to kind of think critically. But I think, the divisiveness is one thing, the huge division in the country. And then I think, honestly, I feel like electronics and social media.
No.
Well, I would feel like, especially for kids, right? Like, they're there's so much good. There's so much good that I feel like has come from social media and from technology. I mean, with like on, on Twitter or on Instagram or on live streams. I mean, we can connect with people from all over the world, right? Like I mean, on Twitter, on X, I have friends from like all over the world, right? So there's definitely like a level of connection and community that we have at our fingertips that we just would not have without these things. So it's definitely not all bad, but I think that, especially when I see like the kids and the teens that I work with, there's a lot of cyberbullying that goes on. And there's a lot of influence that is happening. And a lot of it is really covert. And a lot of it is happening kind of under the note, like parents are not aware of a lot of it. And so kids are being influenced. And things can get really bad, right? To the point of like, there being some like really like dangerous or like trafficking situations, because that can happen and does happen. There's just so much. I think, social media, when you can hide behind a screen, people, and adults do this too. I see this all the time, that we feel like we have so much more freedom to say things when we can hide behind a screen. Like people are not, I assume, maybe some people do, but like are not saying the same things, would not say the same things face to face with a person that they would over like a DM or responding on a post or a text or, something like that. So I think social media is very connecting, but it's also very disconnecting at the same time. It's kind of a weird
100%. I agree, because
phenomenon.
I'm not a very popular person on Twitter X recently, only because I've done a personal experiment, and one of the things is my feed was just getting crazy, and my consumption of social media was getting crazy. So I said, you know what? I'm just going to start unfollowing people, because I can't do this. I used to follow about 3,000 people, and I just started mass unfollowing. And then I had to revamp that, because I'm like, I'm hurting people's feelings. I was hurting a lot of people's feelings. And so I had to come out with a strategy. I said, I don't want to just unfollow people. I still like their content. I just can't consume 3,000 people's content. And then it got smaller and smaller and smaller, and to the point where, you know what, I'm just going to create and deliver content. And when I'm ready, I will look at people's content, because I cannot sit here on my phone all day and listen to people have conversations or looking at pictures or videos. So what I started doing was I created folders of people's interests and things that I like. And when I'm ready, I click on those folders, folders, and then I'll look at their content. Now my follow list is very, very small. I don't think I even follow you on Twitter.
I think you don't follow me, and my feelings are so hurt.
I know. So let's get some therapy. But the truth is, a lot of the people's content that I consume, I don't even follow them. And so I tried to voice that on X, but it's not a popular theology, if you want. That's not the right word. That's not a popular method, because people don't like that, right? So, but for me, it works. I don't consume content anymore unless I consume what I want to.
Right.
Twitter's not throwing it in my face where, hey, look at what's happening. Christina just posted a salad. I'm like, what? Look at this salad. So, and it's not popular, because I've had a lot of people, not a lot, but people would message me, did I hurt your feelings? Why did you unfollow me? I'm going to block you. I'm like, hey, that's fine. I'm totally fine with that. But social media is a double-edged sword.
Yeah, it is.
And I think Dr. Heath mentioned a lot about it, where unfortunately he's gained a nice source of clients because of social media. Because of the things that it causes within a family structure.
Yeah. Well, so like even so I work with a lot of teenagers, right? So like kind of like the big thing now is like, on like, well, I guess on Snapchat too, on Snapchat or on Instagram, like people post their stories. So like we have like an eye into like everything that a person is doing all the time. And so like, you know, I'll have like teens come in and like there's friends posting stories about going and doing something and they weren't invited or included. And, you know, back in the day, like, because I didn't have a cell phone until I was a junior in high school.
Wow.
So
Progressive.
if like if if friends were off doing something without me, I mean, the only way that I knew about it would be if like they were talking about it later, which I guess, you know, maybe sometimes would happen. But I just feel like there's so much more, like I'm seeing like my kids and teens feeling like they're left out, and they're like able to see like, oh, everyone else is having so much more fun than I am, or they're doing
Mhm.
crazy and I don't get to do that. So there's a lot of comparison happening. Yeah, a lot of comparison happening. And adults do that too. And then cyberbullying, I think, is like a big thing. So, and you know, and then just like the constant, like it's so overstimulating. Like our brains were not designed to have that, like just constant. Our brains were not designed to have constant notifications going off.
Yeah.
And I will say, like for me, and you know, Josh gets on me about this sometimes because he's very involved and active on X, especially within like the stock community and things like that.
Hmm.
I get overwhelmed by social media, so I will just like shut it all down. Sometimes like I'll go days or sometimes weeks without being on social media. I don't do that so much anymore with X, but because I have good communities there. But I will put my phone on do not disturb, and I just, because the notifications just overwhelm me. Like our brains were just not designed for that. So I think, you know, I wouldn't say that like social media is like the root cause of all of these like mental health issues, but it certainly is not helping. Again, it's just like our brains were not wired for it. So there's like, I don't know, maybe there needs to be some evolution within our bodies and brains, and maybe that's already happening, right? For our bodies and brains to evolve to be consumers of like social media and electronics and technology and all of that. But
That I will say, the way I did my follow unfollow list, it really changed my consumption radically. And that's just, it works for me. I don't recommend it for everybody because you lose some friends, some online friends, but it really it's healthier for me in the respect of time consumption. And I think it's a problem when you wake up in the morning and the first thing you want to do is grab your phone, right? That is a problem for us as adults. I mean, kids.
it's an addiction.
Yeah. So what is a solution for kids that have those? Oh, actually, before I get into that, since we're talking about kids and teenagers, I heard this term today. I was watching a video. I don't like the guy, but I watched clips of him. But his name is Charlie Kirk, and he goes to universities, and I'm sure he has a good heart. But sometimes he starts conversations with people, and it's so insightful. Like they get triggered, right?
Mm-hmm.
But he made an important comment in the area of, I'm trying not to go too sideways, but he said, the minute we stop talking is when conflict comes. When we stop having those conversations, that's when married couples stop talking, that's when divorces happen. When countries stop talking, that's when wars begin.
Mm-hmm.
And so the girl that was responding to him, she said, because he was saying, we're not being violent, we're just talking. And she brought up a term, and she said, well, you're causing emotional violence. You're inciting emotional violence or psychological violence. And I've never heard that term before. I'm not sure if you've ever heard that term before, but is that a possibility for someone to cause psychological or emotional violence by just having a conversation, whether it's on Twitter, Instagram? Is that a real thing, or is that just something somebody just spit out?
I've heard that terminology before.
You have? I've never heard it.
Like at the extreme end, I mean, like, so like cyberbullying. I mean, cyberbullying is a thing. So can somebody like cause like emotional distress in somebody through like, you know, comments that they're making, and whether that be over, you know, social media or in conversation? Sure, I think like to an extreme, but I think so. Terms like that and terms like gaslighting.
Well, what is gaslighting? Natural definition of gaslighting?
Gosh. Well, so what I would say is how it is used now, I think tends to be really overused, but essentially like being made to, so if somebody's gaslighting you, they're essentially like making you believe that like what you're thinking or feeling is like not real. Like this is not actually like what's going on. Like your people, I mean, I think like a non like politically correct way would be to say like, oh, you're just crazy. Like you're not thinking right, you know? So being very dismissive of a person's experience. So, and that, you know, and that's certainly like there are definitely like there is emotional abuse and relational abuse that happens where that does happen, right? So but now we're taking phrases like that and like we're like using them for everything. So like in this, I mean, I guess I can't speak because I don't know that particular conversation, but I would say like if somebody is, you know, getting uncomfortable with a conversation, that doesn't mean that they're being gaslit or that they're, you know, that this person is inciting like, you know, emotional violence on them. So I think we have gotten very, I would say we've gotten very kind of trigger happy with the way that we like are using some of those words. And it really, unfortunately, I think then it really just, to me, like it desensitizes everything around it. And then what it actually is and what it actually does, like we lose like the deeper meaning, you know, around that.
True. Yeah. So when I hear the word violence, I think of someone actually grabbing my kids and causing harm. Now, are there words or psychological things that can become violent to where it actually hurts the person without their consent? Is that the right way to phrase that? Is that possible for someone to be psychologically hurt violently without their consent?
Sure. I mean, I would say that's what, I mean, you know, in an abusive relation, I mean, you know, abuse can happen not just physically, right? There can be mental and emotional and psychological abuse. Right. And I have, you know, I've worked with many clients. I mean, many of the clients that I had even in the foster care system, you know, were there was like, you know, physical or sexual abuse or drugs in the home or something like that. There was other stuff going on, but there was a lot of verbal, emotional, psychological abuse going on in the vast majority of those situations as well. So yes, absolutely. Like it can be very damaging to who we are as a person, right? Abuse can happen where it's not, I'm not being physically hurt. But again, I would say, you know, that terms like, you know, emotional violence, that to me, that's a phrase and a terminology that's very separate from like emotional abuse, right?
Okay.
From my perspective. So not that it doesn't happen, but I think that we've gotten really trigger happy again with what we say things are. So
I guess my concern with that conversation is, where does it put their responsibility or accountability, right, in that discussion? Like, is it my, where does it lie?
Right. Whose responsibility is it, right? So I would say, again, like I don't have any context for this conversation, right? But so let's say like in a conversation between you and I, if you say something that like, and I start to feel uncomfortable, or we like to use the word triggered. Oh, you're triggering me.
Yeah.
Well, I'm an adult. I am responsible for my emotions. I'm responsible for my responses. I'm responsible for my reactions. So you cannot cause me to have any emotion. If I have any sort of emotional reaction or response, I'm choosing that, right? And that's with you know, kind of you know, we're both adults, we are independent, we're, you know, functional, right? I would say that there can be a lot of gray area when it comes to kids, because kids just don't have the emotion rate. Their brain is just not developed to have the same level of like regulation, right? So I think that can be, you know, I would not have the same expectations for a child.
Right. True.
But you're right. Like, you know, so in a conversation, well, if I'm, you know, I don't know that this is maybe going to be an unpopular opinion, because, you know, now everything has a trigger warning to it. right? I see posts and I see, you know, everything has a trigger warning. And I'm like, well, I'm an adult. If I'm choosing to consume this content, I would hope that I would know myself well enough to know, like, hey, like if this is going to be bothering me, like I'm just not going to consume this content, right? But it's nobody else's. I don't see that it's anyone else's job to tell me like, oh, hey, like be aware of this. I'm like, well, I should be aware of that myself, right? Um, so yeah, I think that that's a good point. Like, well, where does the onus lie? Whose responsibility is it, right? Who
So
are
I agree with the part now when it comes to kids, that's a little bit different, right?
yeah,
Um, and I want to try to steer back to where I left. I sidetracked us on the conversation, but to go back to the mental health crisis, especially with the era of kids and social media, all these things. Are there numbers? Is there anything that can give us a picture of what it actually looks like in the area of this mental health crisis? Since we're talking about kids and teenagers, like what does it actually look like, at least from your personal perspective?
yeah, sure. I mean, I'm sure that there are numbers. I don't have statistics right off the top of my head, but you know, I will say from my experience and what I see coming in is I see a lot of depression, a lot of anxiety, um, a lot of friendship issues, a lot of, but honestly, like anxiety is probably like the biggest thing. Like these kids are so anxious. And again, I think that that's a byproduct in large part of like, there's just, I think like they're inundated with things. So whether it be like on the news, right?
Yeah.
Or whether it be on social media. But the just the general kind of climate, I would say, in the United States, because there is so much division, like that does impact our kids. Whether you know whether they're like directly aware of what's going on or not, there's like an energetical feel to it. So I would say like I have a lot of kids coming in with anxiety and depression, um, and just and I would say just like identity confusion,
Yeah.
and things like that, and just and a lot of like in a lot of like distress and in like a lot of turmoil, around that, and feeling like they're having to navigate things that I just feel like you shouldn't have to be worrying about when you're 10 years old. um,
Can I chime in on that? And so I'm Hawaiian, Chinese, Filipino. I want to throw that out there before I bash China. But um, and this is a joke I heard. It's so in China, one of the things I heard was, so a lot of my experience being born and raised Hawaii, just knowing the Chinese culture. One of my friends, his son, graduated. He graduated top of his class. Super smart kid, got scholarships everywhere. He's creating some kind of nanotechnology in Germany. He's a super smart kid, Chinese, right? But he also played sports. He played multiple sports, like 3 or 4 sports, and plays piano and violin. I'm like, how in the world do you figure this stuff out? And one of the jokes about China is that these kids are becoming so intelligent, so smart, that there's so much pressure being put on them to learn and educate and to become a good citizen of society. Whereas in America, there's so much pressure being put on our kids to figure out what their identity is versus educating them.
yeah, I agree.
And that's crazy. If that's true to some degree, even if it's true to 1% or 5%, that is kind of alarming for us as a nation. Like, and you said division earlier, and I think you said it twice, but when you say division, where is that coming from, or what does that division look like?
Well, I mean, I think I mean, politically, there's a lot of political division, and I think I don't know. I feel like we are finding division wherever we can find it, right? So division
Right.
between like religious or spiritual beliefs or political beliefs or around like certain like certain laws or human rights issues or the environment or the economy or um, and I just I don't know that I have like the magic answer. I mean, I don't have the magic answer. I think if I did, maybe I'd be president. I don't know. I would not want that job. That sounds like way too much responsibility. but I think it was interesting about like that conversation that you were saying that you were watching of this guy that's kind of a little bit provocative, but that he made the comment of, once we stop talking, like that's when the problems really start. Right. And I would say, there's an aspect of that. Like, I agree. Now, conversation needs to be within like certain parameters, right? Because like, what, are we talking about like actually having civil like conversation or civil debate?
Yeah.
Because debate's not bad. I think debate is great if you can handle it appropriately, right? But my experience has just been, I mean, the vast majority of adults are not, handling that, very eloquently or appropriately. And then what is that doing for our kids? I mean, what kind of example is that giving to like our younger generation? So, I mean, I have a lot of kids that are feeling just really hopeless. And feeling like, I mean, I've had kids afraid that, our country is going to break out into like a civil war, or that we're going to get involved in a world war. And I'm like, I don't know. You know what? Like, your fears are not, to me, like super unbounded. Like, I right? But I think that there is like, you've got to figure something out. And I would say, especially if not for us, like for our future generations, because they're feeling the impact. They're feeling the impact of our inability to appropriately and respectfully resolve differences.
Well, we're not being adults, first of all. I mean, if we're talking about political things, like, I personally don't care in terms of right or left or middle or top shelf, but I don't care. What I do see, though, is if our kids are watching two grown men, political candidates, duke it out verbally on national television, talking about golf scores and how I'm tougher than you and you're a loser. Like, these are our political leaders talking like that. Mm-hmm. I get it. And I think we spend billions and billions of dollars. I think the mainstream media produces, I think the last number I saw was $65 billion a year. That's just mainstream media. We're not talking about social. Mm-hmm. And I thought about that. I'm saying, we're paying these guys $65 billion a year to go on TV to talk about other people on what they're doing for a living. Mm-hmm. And our kids, and this is what we consume. Mm-hmm. And when you talk about division, I totally get it. Like, and the thing is, who's causing this division, right? Like, who is it? Us? Is it the 5%ers? Like, who? Well, here's the next question: who's allowing it to continue?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. I mean, truthfully, I think we're all allowing it to continue.
I agree, 100%.
So like, I feel like things are not going to get better if we are not each individually taking. Now, I can only take like accountability and responsibility for myself, right? Mm-hmm. And I can do I do what I can to help my clients, right? So that's me trying to give back and trying to help teach them how to be, I would say, like appropriate consumers, right? And to know, like, where, like, what do you believe in? Where is your integrity? What are your values? Don't let anybody sway you on your beliefs, on your values, whatever they are, right? And you should grow into that and find those for yourself. Don't let yourself be influenced. And they don't need to align with mine. Because I don't even, when I, in the therapy room, I don't talk about myself personally. Mm-hmm. I care about them, right? I care about their development. But I would say, so even outside of, I mean, that's a very like clinical look at it, but I would say just as humans, I think, we're all contributing. We're all complacent in it to a degree. And I think that's going to make people feel pretty uncomfortable. But it's easy to be passive. It's easy to be passive. Especially because I would say, and I get it, because I think it's like very overwhelming, right? How there's so much that I think like our entire like infrastructure needs to change. Well, how do we do that? But I think it takes some of those, it takes that step, those initiatives just in myself. I can choose my response. I can choose what I consume. I can choose, how I talk to other people. Um, and yeah, I mean, again, it's not like a magic wand answer, but I think if we all were to take accountability, I think that we would be in a different place.
Well, I think it starts at home, right?
Yeah, it does.
And I'm not saying like, because we've needed help, like my wife needed counseling at one point. One of my kids needed counseling at some point. Aside from that, I think if it starts at home, let's do what is required to be a parent or to be someone that produces history makers. Like what I believe what you're doing, Dr. Christina, is that every time you counsel someone or you walk them through a therapy session or you give them guidance, that's a literal history changing moment, whether we see it happen or not. And I think as parents, and we're talking about division, like I get it. This nation is divisive, that we are divided. But I think, like we said earlier, like we're allowing it to continue.
Yeah.
And it's funny because here in Oregon, where we live, so Hawaii is typically a blue state. I think that's what they call it. Mm-hmm. But nobody acts like it in Hawaii because it's Hawaii. We're kind of away from the rest of the mainland. We're in paradise. But now that we're here in Oregon, it's like I understand now why people are divisive. I totally get it. Mm-hmm. Because we live in a farm town. Typically, farm towns are typically reddish-ish, if that's the right terminology, right? But here in this farm town, nobody cares, right? It's such a small town. Like they don't care what your political affiliation is. Now they do care if you open your mouth and start preaching to them on how they're wrong. Now that conversation, the dynamic changes.
Sure.
But yeah, but the that divisive part, I understand that, and it's sad in one way, but I'm kind of excited in one way because my kids, they're not subscribing to that philosophy, so I'm not worried about that. Mm-hmm. I think if we have more people raising their kids up, or even just raising people up through mentorship programs, to not subscribe to that, I firmly believe that. I think we cover a lot of heavy topics, and there's a lot more. I do believe, though, that this whole issue of the mental health crisis and how the division, it starts at home. And I know it's hard, right? There's a lot of families that are working multiple jobs. Maybe they're not able to spend time with their kids, but investing that time is very important. In terms of the families that you work with and even teenagers, what do you think is going to work to improve on this mental health crisis? And let's add the family dynamic to it. Do you see anything that's going to work?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you said is really a key, that we do need to see a return of a return of like accountability and responsibility within the family, I would say. And so, so parents being the ones to teach and educate and train their children, rather than relying on schools to educate their kids, or social media, or I mean anything. And those things are great. Like we need those things, right? So again, I was talking about systems before. Like there's a reason why we live and function in multiple systems, and we need those, right? And there's a role that schools play. There's a role that social media can play. There's a role that social groups can play. But I really do think that, there needs to be like a level, there needs to be a return to the home, and a level, I would just say, of just like even that relational connectedness within family, right? So, gosh, I would love there to be a way for all parents to be able to spend, the time with their kids that they want to, and not have to be working, 3-4 different jobs just to try to make ends meet, or have to be, working, night shifts, or, you know, and being able to have that time. So, I mean, I think that there's a lot of things that I think need to be fixed, but I would say whatever we can do to bring back support and resources to family so that parents can be there with their kids, that they can communicate with their kids, that they can educate their kids, that they can just engage and be around them. You know, that's really where I see, I think that there could be a lot of improvement just, I mean, with all of our well-being. I think if we were able to, you know, be able to have like that return to the family unit.
The biggest struggle is finances, I think,
Yeah.
for us when it's, I don't know if you know, but we homeschool our kids. That's how we're able to travel so much. We can just travel anywhere we want as long as we have an internet connection.
Yeah.
You know, as long as the kids get their work done, hey, we can go take a trip. But the issue comes always with finances. But I don't think it's even just that. A lot of it too is what we were sold generationally, right? We were sold that mom and dad needs to go to work. Mom does her professional job. Dad does his professional job, so they can get the BMW and Mercedes in the garage and a boat outside, and they have the log cabin on the beach, or not beach, but the lake, and we take the vacation every year. It's hard to give that up. And when we decided to homeschool our kids, like, we had one less income. And I think this is powerful where Josh comes in, because he can teach us all to make millions of dollars with stocks and investments and various forms of financial advice. But that's a big issue, is how can I change my lifestyle to be able to raise my kids? Because now our kids are home, and sometimes it's crazy to have the kids home all the time, right?
Yeah.
But I don't regret it. We don't regret it one bit. Our oldest daughter went to public school, and we put her in private school, but her last 2 years, we homeschooled her. And that was all because of what you said earlier. I didn't jump the gun too early on this one, but it was because of division. There was division in the country. There was division in our state politically, which actually translated to our school system. Yeah. It really did. And I don't like to get into politics, but I'll say this. They passed a law in Hawaii, which we protested. We had like 10,000, 20,000 people protesting this law that they're trying to pass in the middle of the night, mind you. Not finding out till later that the law, it makes sense at face value with the law that they're trying to pass, because it was for equality and all these things. But what they didn't tell the public in Hawaii was there were these other agendas attached to this, which went to our educational system. And once we saw that, Dr. Christina, we're like, okay, I think we're done. I think we're done with this public education system. I think it's time we teach our kids. And it was hard, but I don't regret it one bit, you know. And I think we need more of that. We do need more people, maybe not necessarily just homeschooling, but investing more time with their kids. You know, whatever you can do. I totally agree with that.
Sure. And then accessibility to be able to do that, right? So can we get this country to a place where people have where people would have the option? I have the option to homeschool, or to at least do like what do they call it? Like a co-op, right? Where there's maybe like, you know, people are taking turns, and like there's, you know, so it's not necessarily that the parents are the ones that have to be like home and like with their kids, right? You know, 24/7, but yeah, I think, you know, that's just where, like, I think, you know, the resources and support need to go back to the family, and towards supporting the parents, you know. And I try to, I mean, so, you know, my clinical work is, again, predominantly with kids and teens, but I involve parents very heavily, most of the time where it's appropriate to do so. I certainly, you know, there's definitely a level of appropriateness of giving, you know, my kids and teens their space, and, you know, they can, because sometimes, you know, they have conflict with their parents, so they want to be able to have a private space to be able to talk about that, where it's not going to get back to their parents, right? So I do have, you know, patient confidentiality even with my minor clients, but I do a lot of parent coaching and parent education, and I will tell you that, like, I have I mean, I have very, very rarely, I could count probably on one hand or less the number of like a negative impact that has had, or a negative interaction or response that I've gotten from a parent. Generally they're wanting to know what to do to help. They don't know what to do. And so, being able to, whether that be through coaching, but also being able to offer resources, right? Like, is there a support group? Are there tools? Are there books? Are there, podcasts? Are there, I think like what can we do just to bring that support back to parents, and not just be pointing the finger at parents,
Mhm.
right? Or blaming parents for everything, right? Because just from a psychological standpoint, if you're pointing the finger at somebody, that's automatically going to get somebody on the defense,
Yeah.
which is not an appropriate way to handle conflict, right? So, yeah.
So when we homeschooled, and my wife, she'll tell you, just to get the resources and learning about co-ops, we found out there's two things that we found out. Number one, when my daughter went to college, the college they didn't care about the high school diploma. It wasn't a requirement. They didn't need to see the diploma. They just wanted to make sure that she would be a good fit. She passed of course she did her SATs, PSAT, but they didn't care about the diploma. It wasn't even required for if you want to furnish a transcript, you can, but that really doesn't tell the college everything, because really what they want is, did they pass the entrance exam? Are the scores high enough? That's what they care about, the scores. That's the first thing we learned about college, or I'm not sure if all colleges are like that. And then the second thing we learned was there's not a lot of support from a state level. Part of our belief is that they don't want people to homeschool their kids. That's just our personal belief. We don't feel that they want, because they make it very difficult. And they kind of require you to go through the system, even though you're homeschooling your kids. And the scary thing for us is that, and I went to public school and private school, but there's a ceiling. There's a ceiling that when I get to the third grade, I can only do third grade. If I'm smarter than third grade, oh, too bad, you're still in third grade. Our kids, if they want to go up to seventh grade when they're in third, go ahead, by all means, do it. Like, we're not going to force you to stop. And I always brag about my daughter, one of my kids, but our youngest daughter, she created her first program at 10 years old. She started coding at 10.
That is awesome.
But she doesn't do it anymore because she don't care. So she could if she really want. And now she likes to bake and cook, make things fresh, and she likes to do gardening, and she does a whole. I can't even read off the list. But my point is, there's no ceiling, and nobody tells our kids, "Hey, stop! You're getting too smart," right? And there's no control. Like my wife put it up. Our state, actually, she's very right. The state did want control for whatever. I don't know the political aspect of it, but from a mental perspective, I totally understand it. Yeah. Now, I didn't. In terms of, we're going way back to the beginning when I asked you about, well, why did you choose children and teens? Do you babysit now at this age? Do you have anybody that you, any nieces, nephews, neighbor kids that you babysit or take care of?
No, I don't do. I do have nieces and nephews, but I don't really do babysitting. I'm busy. I'm busy working now.
I'm sure.
I care about the people's kids all day. But no, I just like they bring what I would say that I don't think that I really necessarily reflected as much before. Kids and teens, to me, there is such like there's a spark to them that I feel like a lot of adults have, not that it's gone, but it's maybe been buried. And there's just like a level of hopefulness and energy that I feel, from kids. And so it really, like, it's energizing for me to be around kids and teens, and they have they're creative and they're imaginative. And so yeah, I prefer their company to adults probably most of the time.
Dr. Heath, I can't remember. I know he's been practicing for 40 years. Dr. John, close to 40 years. Dr. John went into the area of, drug addiction and in that area. Dr. Heath is, he's done it all from educating. Have you thought about, because my cousin, Dr. Terry Lynn, she teaches in Nevada, I think Nevada State University, and she also operates in Hawaii and Nevada. Have you considered possibly teaching at the university as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be, I mean, at least as like a guest lecturer, that would be something that would be fun. I mean, I like teaching. I like speaking. I feel like, I don't know that would, like, I wouldn't want to like shift 100% to that, but I think, I do enjoy that aspect of it. And, there is something, kind of like training like the next generation. Like there is something that's like really cool about that. Because again, I mean, I can think of a lot of things within like the mental health system that I want to change. But then it comes back down to like, okay, well, whose responsibility is that, right? And what am I doing? What steps am I taking to kind of like perpetuate and affect that change? So yeah, it's definitely something that I've considered. And again, I think that's why psychology for me is so fun, because there's just so many different avenues and aspects that, that I can explore. So, I would say especially like, when we can get to a place of where there's really good, I would say stability within like my practice, that would definitely be something that I would entertain as a possibility, when I can kind of maybe step back a little bit more from more of the clinical role of things.
Well, I'll say this. We're going to come in for the landing, but I wanted to touch up on the area of your creative side. I hope you do a podcast, because I would subscribe to that channel. Because, we're talking about social media, right? Where we're so glued to our screens. And I love doing this. I love learning. I'm taking notes, Dr. Christina. I can show you my desk. I've got so I do colors. You can't see that. And I got pink and I got yellow. Now the trick is, I'm going to use a clinical term. Is there a carryover? Have you heard that term?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is there going to be a carryover from today to tomorrow for me? So I got to figure out what I'm going to do with all these notes. But in the area of content creation, and the podcasting, I love it, because I can be, I was cutting grass the other day and had a podcast playing. I don't have to necessarily watch it per se. I can just listen to it. But this long form conversation, I hope you do it, because we need more conversation where there's no boundaries, there's no time limits, except what's set, by us, and where people can just share and talk freely and be honest about what's really going on. And in the area of mental health and psychology, we need more of that. I don't think it's a mistake that you're my fourth guest that is a clinical psychologist. Yeah. There's something fishy going on here. I don't know what it is, but I'm not going to go to school and get my degree in no, that's not what I'm saying. Forget that. But
well, you said it works by osmosis, right? So
exactly.
You become a little bit more of a psychologist every time that you get to interview one.
You know what? I learn a lot. I didn't learn so much from Dr. Heath. Dr. Heath, yeah, he's all right, but Dr. Heath was very interesting. Of course, my cousin, Dr. Terry Lynn, she was more of a personal thing. That was more like I got my own therapy, but I did it online, right? So, but I hope you do a podcast. I think that'll be meaningful, and I'll be your greatest supporter. And of course, any tips and best practice. I'm not the best. I just like turning on the camera and talking. With your book. Just remember now, when you hit that millions of dollars, I want 1%.
Sounds good. Good. It's on the recording.
Anything before we do rapid fire? Anything on your heart before we do rapid fire?
I would just really like to thank you for the time. This has been really fun for me. I'm looking at the time, like how long we've been going, and I'm like, oh, it does not, like, I don't feel like you did not grill me with questions. Like it was an interview, but it didn't feel like it didn't feel like an interview. It just felt like you, I think you had mentioned like the phrase like a fireside chat.
Yeah.
I just really appreciate I appreciate you, and I appreciate just your energy and your demeanor that you bring to this. It just made it be a really fun conversation. I feel like, it was probably, hopefully people could track along because we went off on so many different tangents, but that's the way that my brain works. So I thought it was great. But I really appreciate this opportunity. It was just really genuinely very fun for me to get to be a part. So I feel honored to be on here. Thank you so much for allowing me this opportunity.
Well, I appreciate you. I like going around in circles. So my wife is like, honey, stay up.
Time.
Hey, my wife is like, honey, because, okay, I know our time really ran away pretty quick. I didn't even realize it. But my Auntie Alicia, she's like my sister that I never had. And anyway, she's like me. She's like, oh, squirrel, squirrel. But she is, I think she's like 90%. She's like 90% native Hawaiian. She teaches Hawaiian. She's a teacher for probably 30 years now. And I want to do a podcast with her, but she never agrees to a time. And she always, I don't know how to talk. Auntie, you've been talking for like 60 years of your life. But my wife says it's probably a good idea because you and her would never talk about anything but circles and circles. But I think this is where we're the most honest, is when we're just, we're in the same living room, we're at the dinner table, and we're just talking.
Yeah.
And so I appreciate you giving your time, and I appreciate Josh Frog sacrificing 3 hours away from his wife. I want to say thank you, brother Josh. I appreciate you. Rapid fire. Here we go. You answered the first question, by the way, so we don't have to. But well, maybe you did, or maybe I'll ask it anyway. First question is, why did you do the podcast today?
Oh, yeah. I think that I got to listen into part of when you were doing live, I think with the third person that you did it with. And I liked your style. And I wanted to be able to have conversation. And again, for me, anything that I can do to contribute towards like breaking the cycle and getting more education and awareness around mental health, like that's what my passion is. So, yeah.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate it. Number 2, California or Iowa?
Well, so I would say now Iowa. Things that I miss about California. I miss the ocean. And I miss the food. And I miss the weather. I grew up when I was growing up, like to me, like the weather was just so boring. It was always the same. I was talking about this, I think in another space that I was doing on X the other day, that like the weather was like always between maybe like 68 and 72 degrees and like partly cloudy, like where I live. And, which is like gorgeous weather, but I was so bored. But I do miss it now from time to time. The weather in Iowa is very, dramatic and very, very, it is very exciting. But I would say, just like energetically where I'm at now, Iowa, it's a much slower pace. I was living in like the Los Angeles area. It was just so overwhelming and overstimulating. So I feel, Iowa, it's more, I'm more connected to nature. I feel like I can relax. I can be just like present. I don't feel like I have to be like go, go, go all the time. It's just a different vibe here for sure.
Number 3, you terminate all social media, but you're allowed to have one. What is it?
Oh, I gotta go with X, Twitter. I've found just such a fun, that's how I connected with you. I've found such a fun community there. So that would be it for me.
Number 4, Bitcoin or Ethereum?
I've never heard of Ethereum.
Okay, you got to pick one, BTC or ETH.
I got to go with Bitcoin, I guess.
Okay.
Josh, help me out.
Number 5, water or Gatorade?
Water. we just had a whole conversation on Gatorade.
Exactly. That was a premature question that I should have deleted. Number 6, money not an issue, or time, if money is never an issue, but if money or time not an issue, where are you and the husband going on a 1-month vacation?
Oh, and I get to pick? Okay. At this point, I would probably say Australia. That would be where I would want to go.
Out there in the water with the saltwater crocs there. Yes, sir. Number 7, favorite place to find peace. A physical location, whether it's in your home, at a park. Where is your favorite place to find peace?
My back patio. My back patio. I've got my little garden there. I've got flowers there. I can hear the birds. That is where I feel like the most at peace.
All hindrances aside, which we mentioned earlier, how many degrees are you going to get? How many PhDs are you going to achieve?
Oh gosh. Well, I don't know. It would be fun to maybe get at least one more. If everything else, if I could just like go to school for the rest of my life and get paid to do it, sure. I would just keep going to school and learning as much as I could. So at least one more, maybe 2.
Number 9, a big, fat, juicy steak from Snake River Farms in Idaho. Medium rare with all the seasonings with a perfect crust, juicy as all juicy can get, or a house salad from McDonald's.
Oh, I gotta go with the steak. Does anybody choose that salad?
I'm just kidding. So actually, the actual question is steak or salad?
I would say steak. I'm a meat girl, that is for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Last question. What is your desire for the next generation?
Oh, that's like a deep question. I want the next generation, I want them to know who they are. And I want them to be secure in who they are.
That's like a missile that hit the bunker in like Afghanistan. We're just waiting for it to explode. And I think you're spot on. To know who they are is identity.
Yeah.
For sure. And I think what you do is definitely generation. I don't know if you feel that way, Dr. Christina, but anybody that helps families overcome some of these psychological things, you're leading the way in an area of generational mindsets. That's what I firmly believe. So yeah. I want to say thank you for your time. I'm telling you this much, Dr. Christina. Like, I told my wife the other day, I said, honey, I still trip out that people want to spend time with me. Like, what the heck? And what they don't realize is that I'm taking notes and I'm actually getting a free education. So thank you for the free PhD that I'm picking up.
You're welcome. I love that. That's really fun for me because I love the conversation, and so it's really fun that you are taking notes and that you got something out of it. And thank you for your time, and for your wife too for letting you take this time with me. I appreciate you and appreciate everything that you're doing. And sending your family much love and aloha too.
Well, family, I just want to say thank you for listening. I'm going to take Dr. Christina off. If you want to follow her on all socials, or for sure Twitter X, it's Dr. Stai. I don't know how she got that username, by the way, but that's her user handle. And I'll post all of the information in the descriptions on all socials. We're going to be live on Spotify, Apple Podcasts later on this evening. I'm gonna edit some. Sue, thank you for being here. My wife, thank you. Sue's been with us. She's out there in Canada. Thank you. Of course, everybody that's enjoying the conversation. We also have Sarah in Newfoundland, Canada. Thank you. 2 Canadians. Oi. Thank you for, I don't know if that's the right term. I'm sorry if that's not, but thank you for hanging out. We appreciate you guys just really investing your time with us, and appreciate you. And all the links, I'll post it in the course descriptions, course descriptions, but the podcast description, I'll post it all there. Thank you just for being here, guys. We appreciate you. I'm always grateful for those of you that invest your time, but we hope that you watch the next one. On behalf of our families, as I always say, love you guys. God bless you guys. Hui ho, aloha, and mahalo. Yes, sir. Chihu.
Hey, what do you say?